all countries practice the black arts. They have spies, they have agents, they resort to bribes, they resort to blackmail. But I do believe Israel has made a large use, let's call it extracurricular use, of its intelligence agencies. This use of blackmail, Israel is maybe in a category all its own.
I just read the preface to your upcoming expanded edition of your book, I'll Burn That Bridge, and you and I have spent a number of conversations, a great deal of time, talking about Israel and Palestine, and we will get there, I'm sure, today. But I wanted to start out with something that we haven't talked much about, and that's Donald Trump, cancel culture. And I wanted to ask what it was in a nutshell, maybe before we get into some details. What went wrong for the left in this election that saw Harris lose and Trump win?
I think it's obvious what went wrong. Here I don't believe. Usually I defer to expertise. I believe in that. I believe in hard work, and you have to do serious investigation before you go before a public and you're presenting information. And it's extremely irresponsible to use your title or your notoriety to present information which you haven't thoroughly investigated. But in this case, I don't believe it requires a great deal of expertise. What went wrong with the Democratic Party candidacy or campaign, there was no platform. There was nothing on offer. It was simply negative. Trump was Hitler. Trump was fascism. Trump was a serial molester of women. It was entirely negative. And such a campaign, given the levels of disaffection in our country, had no possibility of winning office. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking. I said it well before. And it's documented because I did many interviews at the time. And the question of the Democratic Party campaign came up. And I said at the time that I know I'm an outlier. And people like Alan Lichtman, who had a very good record for predictions, was certain that Trump would win. Was certain that Kamala Harris would win. And people like James Carville, they were all very certain. And the one who hedged his bets was, if my memory is correct, Nate Silver in the Times. The very last day, the very last week, he said, I'm getting a queasy feeling. But I didn't get a queasy feeling in the last week. I talked to people. I'm a walker. I used to be a pretty formidable jogger, but now I'm a walker. And I walk along the boardwalk of Coney Island, and I talk to ordinary people. It makes time go faster because I walk 5 to 7 miles a day. And it was clear to me, one thing that was very striking, New York is a democratic town. And if you walk the streets of New York, literally, this is not exaggeration, I didn't see one Kamala Harris button and not one Kamala Harris t-shirt. I saw huge, huge Trump signs. Signs, not even posters, signs.
Really, in New York City?
Yes. You see how you reacted?
Yeah.
And that's how I reacted. I thought, in New York, there's a problem here. Now, here I'm going to say something which, people can feel free to disagree with. I believe that even in 2024, Bernie Sanders could have won the election. Because the thing about Bernie Sanders, that made him a plausible candidate was three things. Number one, the track record. He's been consistent over decades. He's been consistent since the 1970s, so we're talking about a half century. So people could trust him, as in he's the real deal. Number two, he was very careful not to personalize the campaign. If you remember his slogan, it's not about me, it's about us. It's not about me, it's about us. And number three, the platform. Everybody who heard the name Bernie Sanders as a presidential candidate, they knew Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders was skillful at that. You know, people criticized him for constantly repeating himself. But it was a very smart thing to do because he knows the average person will only hear him once. Most people are not news junkies. So there'll be one time they're tuned into him. And so they knew Medicare for all. They knew double the minimum wage. They knew abolish student debt. They knew a Green New Deal. What did you know about Kamala Harris? No, really, I won't claim I followed her campaign under a microscope or under a magnifying glass, but I did follow it. Even now, there was something about giving $25,000 to small homeowners, you know, something she just threw out there. Apart from that, anything? There was no campaign. So now you might say, what did Trump have to offer? Well, the answer is very simple. He represented a throw of the dice. We knew with Kamala Harris, it was more of the same. Now, people like Mehdi Hassan, who gave his take on the election result afterwards, his response was quite revealing. His response was, the economy was doing great, Biden was doing a terrific job, and if people didn't realize that, it's because they're stupid. Well, no, I'm not saying every American voter is an Einstein or a Shakespeare, let alone a Mehdi Hassan. But they have at least a realistic sense of the life that immediately affects them. Paying bills, paying rent, going shopping, buying gas. And by that real life experience, no. By their real life experience, no. This was not a good political investment, another 4 years of Kamala Harris, who made a point of never distancing herself from Joe Biden. When she was directly asked, what makes you different? She didn't have an answer. So if it's a choice between more of the same and a throw of the dice, the rational thing was the throw of the dice. If the current same is awful, well, of course, there's the possibility, well, a throw of the dice would be fascism. But nobody really believed that. It wasn't really a credible claim. You know, if it were a credible claim, let's say AOC, okay, she says, well, we have to vote for Kamala Harris because of fascism. Well, if you really believed it was fascism, why aren't you underground now? No, I'm quite serious. You know, I'll take, a typical example. In the 1950s, the Communist Party feared that there would be incorrectly, but they feared there would be a fascist assault because it was the McCarthy era, and the Communist Party and its affiliates were being targeted. The leaders went underground. They disappeared. That's the assumption, if you really believe that there's a fascist threat. If there was a fascist threat, I was seeing yesterday, I guess it was at, I can't recall, it was at the inaugural, where was it that Donald Trump was sitting next to Barack Obama and they were chatting and laughing? It wouldn't have been the Carter, it was just a few weeks ago, I can't remember which. But they're just happily chatting. And apparently Trump cracked a joke and Obama. Does that look like fascism to you? Does that seem like... So people, in my opinion, correctly, did not take that claim seriously. The reason there's no fascist threat is very simple, because there's no opposition. If you look historically at the emergence of fascism, there were two conditions. Number one, the economic system had broken down, the Great Depression. If you look at Hitler's vote, up until 1929, the Nazi Party was only polling like 3% in Germany. And then right after the crash, it went up to 18%. So number one, you need, to use the jargon, the objective condition. It didn't exist here. And number two, the purpose of fascism was to deal a death blow to the opposition, because the crash triggered, as you can imagine, a harsh reaction from the working class, since they were the main victims of the crash. So the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the trade unions, they represented a formidable force. We don't have a left here. We don't need fascism. Now, you can make the argument that it's going to be a kind of friendly fascism. That is to say, you don't have an opposition, but slowly but surely, the Republican Party is going to push the envelope, see how far they can go in consolidating a really right-wing government in our country. And I think that's a possibility. We'll have some form of authoritarianism they'll try to institute. It will be a question mark, in my opinion, how far the Supreme Court would go along with that as one institution. I mean, obviously there's a large array of institutions of what's called bourgeois democracy. The Supreme Court is one of them. How far they would go along, we can disagree about these things. I teach Supreme Court law. People like Roberts, he's very conservative, for sure, but he believes in the Constitution. He does. He believes in the system of checks and balances, not from an idea, not because he's somehow committed to constitutionalism as an idea. It's because the system works very effectively to keep rich people in power and poor people out of power. It's an effective system, for sure. So why would you want to tamper with it and take the chance of letting in an authoritarian leader, especially one who's as erratic and mentally unequipped as Donald Trump? I don't think people like Roberts, Gorsuch, the others, Kavanaugh, I think they like the system. And I think they believe, from a conservative point of view, they believe, and I think they're correct, the system works. Why tamper with it? Why take a chance of an authoritarian leader with massive power and totally disrupting the so-called checks and balances of our system designed to keep our system stable? So I don't believe, let's say, take one example, the Supreme Court. I don't believe it would even go along with an authoritarian takeover, let alone a fascist takeover. The one big caveat is if the system completely breaks down, let's say there's a huge financial crash. I understand you spoke before me with Richard Wolff. I don't know what his current predictions are. But if there is the possibility of a crash like 1929 and a formidable opposition mobilizes, obviously those are two big ifs. But if those two happen, yes, I believe the Supreme Court would go along with imposing an authoritarian and even a fascist government because the whole system will be in jeopardy. But it's not in jeopardy now. There's no left. Do you think changing your pronouns jeopardizes the system? Do you think that transgender bathrooms jeopardizes the system? Or transgenders attending the bathrooms of their new identity? Does that jeopardize the system? And other than that, is there an organized left, a mobilized left, a left with a vision, anything? No, there's nothing. I have to be honest about that. So you don't need fascism. It's totally gratuitous. There's no opposition.
Speaking of Richard Wolff, who I just spoke with, I asked him a similar question to start off the conversation. And 2 interviews ago, I spoke with Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution because I like talking to people with all sorts of views on the show. And they gave me 2 answers that bear a resemblance to your answer. So what Rick said was that people wanted change and the Democratic Party did not offer it. They did not offer an alternative. And so people reached for Donald Trump.
The roll of the dice.
And what Victor said was that he views the election, the story of the election, as a sort of culture war between the bi-coastal intellectual elite of the left and then the working class that is much more focused on competence and, to use Rick's gloss, they're closer to the soil. And I wonder if you think this second take, the culture war take, can also account for or helps to account for Trump's victory.
Look, there's obviously an element of that. There is, if you use the Nietzschean language, there was the ressentiment of the masses, the toiling masses, the ressentiment against the sneering contempt of these elites. There's no doubt in my mind about it, this kind of superciliousness, this snootiness of people like Mehdi Hassan, who with his Zetio probably rakes in millions, tens of millions. And then when people feel resentments at the lifestyle, at their lifestyle, I'm feeling resentment at their own, meaning paying the bills, paying the rent, not having enough money beyond paycheck to paycheck. And then to say, well, they only believe that because they're stupid. Of course there's going to be resentment. Of course there's going to be resentment. If you recall, Bernie Sanders himself said the Democratic Party has a problem with elitism. There is a real problem there. And there was a paradox. Obviously, Donald Trump belonged to the elite by any reckoning. Social circles, income, holiday resorts, by any reckoning, he's in that elite. but the elites treated him like he was a dumb redneck. He was stupid. He didn't attend one of the Ivy League institutions. And so he attended the Wharton School, but I think everybody understood it was because of his father.
Oh, really?
Money.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, money. I guess it was a military academy and then the Wharton School. Could be wrong about. I know his daughter attended Wharton, but for some reason.
No, he was at Wharton. I just
Yeah.
didn't realize it was because of his money.
I don't think. No, Wharton was the best business school at U of P. So I assumed, your father gets you in. Not unusual. So the more they looked down on him in contempt, the more the toiling masses embraced him as one of their own. So he benefited from all the cultural snootiness of the bi-coastal elites, because he then became one of the common people, which is, of course, completely insane, given his social circles, his background, and everything else. Yeah, there was that element. However, I don't think it would have been an insurmountable barrier had the Democratic Party posed a platform. It is true, by the way, that Bernie came across as being one of the non-elites, and that played in his favor. It was also true. I pass his house every day. I knew where he grew up, and he was a smart guy. He went to Brooklyn College, where I'm currently teaching, for 1 year, and then he went to University of Chicago. Spent most of his time in the library, I think. But the thing about Bernie was you could feel the realness of him. He said, growing up, there were many ugly scenes in my home of my mother and father quarreling about money. I grew up with that. And you don't forget that. You don't forget it. So when people heard that, of course, they're thinking, in my house too, there were the arguments about money. My mother, in an unfair way, said that my father was not a successful breadwinner. He was a factory worker. He eventually became a foreman, but even a foreman was something. My mother was a snob, incorrigible snob. She looked down on. I wasn't happy about. I didn't understand it back then. I understand it now, and in retrospect, I'm not happy about what happened. But there was a realness. Now, Trump, of course, it's completely fake. The baseball cap and everything. No. That's not the circumstances in which he grew up. But the more they looked down on him, that was the irony. The more the bi-coastal elites looked down on him, the more he gained electorally. Because people felt like, oh, they're treating him like they treat us. Stupid. We don't know what's good for us. The Mehdi Hassan, they're dumb.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that immediately jumped out at me in your response was your use of the word supercilious, just because I think we emailed a bit about this. Well, in our last conversation, and I'm going to pronounce the word wrong, you introduced me to the word hagiography or hagiography, thank you. And in reading excerpts from Gravediggers, your upcoming book, I came upon gravamen and then irrefragable, which are two more words that I didn't know. So I'm always very impressed by your vocabulary. I love a good vocabulary. I love learning new words.
The classical writers, I have a student, I'll mention his name, Lucanson Darristal, and he's recently embarked on a journey in the English language. He's now a finalist for Fulbright to study in England medieval literature. And he commented to me, when you read people like Dickens, the classical writers, it's not just they use big words, but that when you look up the definitions, they use it exactly right. Mm-hmm. It's not pedantry. It's, the precisely correct word to use.
Do you know George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language? For our listeners who aren't familiar with it, I don't know if you want to call it his thesis, but one of his main points is that you ought not to use these multisyllabic Latinate words because they just don't flow right. You ought to use old English-based words that are, blood, for instance, words that are, I don't know, maybe just more familiar to our tongue. But you don't seem to feel that way in your own writing.
Sometimes, as I said, the word is precisely correct. So it's not as if you are just being pedantic or flaunting your erudition. It's just the right word. Secondly, I think language is fun.
Yes.
And sometimes you like to use a fun word, which is polysyllabic, just because it's going to cause somebody to go to a dictionary and say, well, now what does that mean? So I think I don't claim to be a writer, not false modesty. I know what real writing is. I know what real writing is. Real writing is mesmerizing. Mm-hmm. When I recently reread Jane Eyre. The first time I read it was in high school English.
Same.
Yeah. And I have to say, there are like five words I don't know on each page.
That's a nice feeling.
5 words I don't know on each page. And that's mesmerizing writing. And so that's a real writer. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a real writer. What I'm good at, I freely admit, I remember Professor Chomsky once in the film was Manufacturing Consent. He just said very frankly, he said, I am a good political analyst. No point in being any false modesty. And it's true. Mm-hmm. You can acknowledge, so long as you don't get too full of yourself, you can acknowledge what I'm good at is constructing a logical argument. Mm-hmm. I put the pieces of the puzzle together in a logical, coherent, compelling way, which leaves no breathing room. Once the argument I've made is over, it's over. You lose. Case closed. It's over. And I try to write as if like a verbal juggernaut to leave no stone unturned in my argument. No room. You're not going to get any breathing room from me. Trapped, over, done. So that I'm pretty good at. It's not easy. It's not Chomskyan linguistics. It's not Einsteinian physics. It's not Newtonian physics. But it's something. One of the things, if you'll permit the digression, in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, it's mostly a paean to individuality. He doesn't stop at individuality, even though he had a very staid, S-T-A-I-D, a staid appearance. His disposition was not staid at all. He praises On Liberty, not individuality. Yes, there are occasional phrases. Eccentricity. The line, my students made me a T-shirt with one of my favorite lines from Mill's On Liberty, that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. And, eccentricities, weirdo. It was in praise of weirdos. But one of the things he said in that essay was, the more valuable you become to yourself, the more valuable you become to others. Which is to say, the more you develop your individual talents, those special, God-given, mysteriously endowed gifts and abilities, the more valuable you become to yourself, the more valuable you become to everybody else. It's not unlike, by the way, Marx, his famous remark, the free development of each is the precondition for the free development of all. The more each of us develops ourselves, the more we have to contribute to society as a whole. So my little talent, this forensic eye, which is monomaniacal and ruthless in searching out the truth.
And on full display in Gravediggers.
You haven't seen a tenth of it. I mean, I have a chapter on the current president of the International Court of Justice, Julia Sebutinde. It's 60 pages. It's pretty brutal.
Great.
It's brutal. And it's a talent, I don't know where it came from, except this, and I want to avoid the self-praise, which becomes kind of egotistical, but this determination to know the truth, wherever it takes me. And it has taken me places which have caused a lot of soul searching in me. But wherever it takes me, I've got to know. I've got to know, And so I've learned, first of all, that's the disposition to want to know the truth. But that's only half the problem. The other half is, once you've found it, how do you construct the argument? How do you construct the argument? Most people, when you're young, I know you're in sciences, so it's different than in my field, in the humanities. There's 3 stages to writing: research, organization, composition. 3 stages, anytime you undertake a project. When you're young, you think the hard part is the research. I have to read all these books, and more books, and oh my God, and actually, the research stage is the easiest. Research is the easiest. Composition, once you know what you want to say, it's not so hard to say. The words come. They may not be Shakespeare, but the words come out. It's that middle step. Mm-hmm. You have this mass of information. How do you organize it into a coherent, clear, compelling argument? And in my view, every step in the argument and every piece of information, it has a place. It has a place. And you have to find where is the place to put this piece in the puzzle. It's not random, and it's not arbitrary. If you construct a tight argument, every piece of evidence and every step in the argument, it has a place. And it could be mentally excruciating to figure it out, and how to present it. In the chapter I wrote on Julia Sebutinde in the forthcoming book, it has 15 tables.
Wow.
Because I discovered that the tables were the clearest form of presentation, that I want the reader to follow me. I want the reader to follow me, and this visual would be the most effective.
Well, just to put a cap on this discussion of language,
Mm-hmm.
I think this idea of using good, interesting language as being fun is crucial. As somebody with a background, albeit limited, in ancient Greek and Latin, it's very fun to see a word I don't know and then try to figure out what it means based on its etymology. So if I look at a word like vociferous and then I think, okay, vos comes from Latin, voice, and ferus would come from Greek to carry, and you see how the meaning of vociferous naturally flows out of its two components. I mean, my favorite story of this is I was reading, do you know E.O. Wilson's work? Yeah, The Myrmecologist, which there's some etymology there too, but one of his books on the insect, I think it's called The Insect Societies, and I came upon this behavior of ants called doulosis. And I just knew immediately what it was because I knew that doulos meant slave in ancient Greek. So it was a chapter on ant slavery. And it's just a little spark of joy to see something like that.
My late mother, she was extremely smart. And I remember my father told me they were in the displaced peoples camps in Austria before the war. After the war, after World War II, in Linz, Austria. And they had decided to come to the United States, so they had to sit down and learn English. And my father told me the story that my mother's English teacher said she was just incredible because she knew the Latin. And so the English came easy to her. But she would always use these words to say, she would describe a person, she would say, she wouldn't say he or she is fat, she'd say corpulent. Yeah, I'm serious. But with no pretense, no pretense, no pedantry. It's just what came to her. So we had downstairs, we had a two-family home, and downstairs we once had a tenant who was a drug addict and a drug dealer. So he used to drive my mother crazy because he was always stoned, and he would, I've never been stoned, I've never taken drugs. I'm a drug-free zone from a child. But you know the disposition when you're stoned. So my mother had to talk to him. He wasn't paying his rent. And he's talking like this. And my mother said, I can't stand to talk to you. You're so phlegmatic. And he went, phlegmatic, whoa. Obviously, she's not trying to impress a drug dealer or a junkie. That was just the way she talked. It came naturally to her.
No, that's very funny. That's what an idiosyncratic way of speaking.
She was learned.
Yeah. Okay, returning to our course of discussion, you mentioned transgender restrooms, and this raises and we talked about that bi-coastal elite, and since it's a major topic of discussion in your book, how specifically did identity politics figure into this election?
I think there was the ambiance of this elitism and this condescension bordering on, and maybe on, not just bordering. There was the condescension bordering on, verging on contempt for ordinary people, in particular, the white working class.
And maybe I should just add this really quickly. I mean, you and I just spoke for 20 minutes about how much we love language. And a lot of identity politics is denigrating the way that people use language. And language is very important to people, and they're going to be very unhappy if you're insulting their language use.
I'm not sure if it's denigrating. I think personally, it's doing two things. It's corrupting language. It sounds terrible. I mean, obviously there are times when you're going to try to make accommodations. So instead of using one who says these things, if one says these things, he's an idiot. So you try to change he to they. I don't think that's a big deal. It doesn't ruin language. But when you start putting in all of these slashes and all of these, it just looks horrible on the page, and how it looks, it makes a difference how it looks on the page. If I see when I'm writing a page and I see it doesn't look good, I change it. Okay, English is not calligraphy. I recognize that. But there is the word just slipped my mind, a visual aspect to how language looks on a page. There's also a phonetic aspect to it. Somebody recently sent me a passage by Bertrand Russell on writing. He was responding to a correspondent. I think it was a 13-year-old girl, if my memory is. And one of the things he said, I thought, yep, that's absolutely right. He says, everything you write, you should read out loud. And if it doesn't sound good, there's a problem. And I do. I read out loud. If it doesn't sound good, it's a problem. And all of this political correctness with language, it makes it very ugly. It's ugly. So that's corrupting language. It's people in departments like rhetoric. You know what department rhetoric is? You know what it is? It's a person who's teaching English and has never read a novel. That's what the rhetoric department is.
I didn't even know there were rhetoric departments.
Oh yeah, that's it. I don't know. Now the humanities are being destroyed, slash and burn with the humanities. But yeah, there was a department of rhetoric. But the people obviously.
What would they teach in that?
What?
What would they teach in that? Speech writing and.
I have no idea, but I know the people who were teaching it.
Okay.
And they've never read a novel. So these people who are trying to police language and are trying to shoehorn political correctness in language, it just slipped my mind. What's the instrument?
A shoehorn.
Yeah, but it's a mechanics instrument. A
lever?
Not lever. It'll come to me. They don't understand what language is. You can't mechanically change language. You can't mechanically change it. It can, not just can, it of course evolves. And phrases which at one time seemed outrageous, they gradually evolve into language. But you can't take a shoehorn, I can't think of the, you can't mechanically change language. Language has its flow. It has its cadence. It has its music. You can't do that like an apparatchik, like some party apparatchik, making language conform to your obtuse or idiotic ideology. So that's one thing, the corruption. The second thing is, and here I know I'm treading in thin water or thin ice, and I have to be careful, not because I'm afraid, but because I want to be right. There's a tendency to want to use language to smuggle in a political agenda or ideology, that you want to be called something which implies, and more than implies, things bearing on issues like biology, and people say, if that's what they want to be called, why don't you call them? What's the big deal? And at some level, it's not a big deal. It's true. It's true. Your name is Robinson, and you say, you know what? I'd rather be called Bobby. What's the big deal? And it's true, there is no big deal, and why should I call you what you want to be called? But there is, in my opinion, a problem where the request that I be called something becomes a Trojan horse in order to impose on me an ideology, not just a personal preference, an ideology which I don't believe is factually correct. Robinson Earhart, I'll call you Bobby, of course, but I'm not going to call you they. I'm not going to do that because you are not a they. So that to me is the second issue, the corruption, the smuggling in of a political ideology. And the third thing, and here again, we have to be careful. There is an element of feeling suffocated, policed, and humorlessness about the way this ideology is being imposed. There was a time where each ethnic group had its stereotypes, but the stereotypes were also a source of humor. You kind of mocked yourself, but it was also, there was again, you're making mockery of the stereotypes, and at the same time kind of acknowledging them. So to take a classical example, I have to always be careful because you're so much younger than me, how much you'll even, what quote unquote, cultural references I make that resonate with you. So in my generation, most of the comedians were Jewish. And one of the most famous was a fellow named Jack Benny. Okay? So Jack Benny's public persona was he was cheap. So there's one of his most famous routines was, it was first on radio, but then when he would perform it on television, he made the transition. And so here is the story. He tells the story that he was walking down the street, and a mugger comes up to him, pulls out the gun, and says to him, "Your money or your life?" Jack Benny stands there, doesn't say anything, and the mugger says, "Your money or your life?" Benny does, "Hey, bud, your money or your life?" And Benny turns to the audience, rests his chin on his hand, and he says, "I'm thinking." So, ethnic stereotypes were sources of humor, good-natured humor, a little self-mockery, and you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. And now you might say, well, it reinforces stereotypes and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I guess it does. So I think it's that sort of stuff, the humorlessness, the crudeness. I mean, when you read these woke testimonies, first of all, they're unreadable. I mean, they're literally unreadable. What is going on here? It's complete trash masquerading as theory. Now, let me be clear. I come from the Marxist tradition, and there was a period where in the 1970s, there was a fellow, the French, this guy, Louis Althusser, and they were structural Marxists. Who the hell knows what they were talking, who they were. They were unreadable, absolutely unreadable. I know that. So it's not as if my historic tradition was immune to that sort of stuff, this kind of unreadable party-oriented, abstract stuff. Yeah, I know. But I would say the difference was you could still discern some intelligence behind this very wooden language. There was some intelligence. Now there's no intelligence. None at all. There is the consequences of the degrading of book culture, written word. There's none. It's completely vacuous when you read it. They use slogans which are substitutes for theory. Everything is settler colonialism, patriarchy, heteronormativity. These aren't concepts. A concept, a real concept, and you know it from the sciences, a real concept is the product of a very deep exploration of an idea. These aren't concepts. They're just catchphrases. Very different. Marx had concepts, mode of production, relations of production, forces of production. Do you know your bookshelf back here could be filled with books written on what does mode of production denote? What does relations of production denote? Those were rich concepts. But settler colonialism, heteronormativity, it's just completely vacuous, because the people who construct these terms are completely empty and vacuous. You take Ibram X. Kendi, anti-racist, and he describes that as being different than opposed to races. What's the distinction? Being anti-racist versus I can't remember his distinction. But they're so empty. And I don't say this glibly. I think I wrote a 60 or 70 page chapter on Ibram X. Kendi, going through every line.
That doesn't surprise me.
That he's empty, or that I devoted 70 pages. Yeah, because he had become a cultural phenomenon. If he had been irrelevance, then no, I wouldn't do it. But it needed to be investigated, whether there was anything there. Most people, if they're great writers, if they're really learned, they convey the concepts without any heaviness of language. I was fortunate in my youth to have as my mentor Paul Sweezy, who was the greatest living Marxist economist. Now, he had a great combination. He was also the editor of the Harvard Crimson. So he understood how to put deeply complex ideas into very readable prose. So even though, those weighty concepts were embedded in his prose, you never saw them. You never saw the weight, because he knew how to make it readable, and also, I had a number of mentors who were also, they weren't just first-rate thinkers, they were also educators. They were people of the left. they want to, I know these are trivial things, but when Marx's Capital came out, and then it was translated into French. Marx's Capital is not easy, especially those first chapters are brutal. Those first chapters are brutal. And when the French translation comes out, he's asked to write a preface. And in the preface, he says, "Nothing pleases me more than the fact that this book will now be available to the French working class." Now, this was a very formidable tome, Volume 1. But at the back of their minds, or I should even say the forefront of their minds, they want to reach people. They want to communicate. They want to, quote unquote, I don't particularly like the phrase, but I'll just say it, to enlighten. So they're always trying to reach. When you read you read Judith Butler, who is she trying to reach? Who? I don't think she even reaches herself. No, it's just gobbledygook. And there's a certain pride, these people take in being, what's the word, where you can't, impenetrable. They take a pride in being impenetrable. Now, that itself, I know you may say, well, that's going too far. That itself tells me these people are not of the left. Because if you're of the left, you want to reach masses of people. That's your goal, your objective. The people in power, they have the money. They have the institutions. They have the organization. The only thing we have, speaking as a person of the left, is we have the numbers. We believe that we speak as, the slogan that came out of the Occupy movement, we are the 99%. We have the numbers, and we have a hope, not a certitude, but a hope that if you can organize the numbers, the 99%, you can change the system. But if you take a pride in the fact that you're impenetrable, then you're not a person of the left. Now, I know that might sound like an extreme statement, but I think it's correct. Now, I don't think Marx reached much of the French working class, but at least it was an aspiration. There's nothing that pleases me more than the fact that this book is now going to be available to the working class of France. I make a determined effort. Everything I write, to reach people, they understand what I'm saying. It's the same thing, by the way, as a teacher. You know what's the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher? There are two things. One, you believe you have something important to say and you want to convey it. And two, a bad teacher starts with him or herself. A good teacher starts with the students. That's where you begin. You're going through material and you're asking yourself, will this work in the class? Will it work? Will this passage resonate? Because let's say you're teaching Mill, Rousseau, Plato, there are 10,000 passages you can look at, right? They are rich. You have 10,000. So how do you decide which passage? Well, obviously one criterion is if this passage has significant historical significance. People always refer to Rousseau and pity, or they always refer to Aristotle and the philosopher, Plato and the philosopher king. So you look, you have to teach concepts which have a large resonance. But even there you have a lot of choices. And then you have to look at the material and you're constantly asking yourself the question, Will it work? Will it work with who you're trying to reach? But if you're writing in a prose that's impenetrable, you can't be a good teacher, and you certainly can't be a person of the left. There's a famous case of, the Harvard sociologist Talcott Parsons. And he was a very famous person of his generation. And he wrote in this dramatic prose, totally unreadable. And then along came this radical sociologist at Columbia University, and his name was C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills, he sits down and he writes this essay, and he takes huge chunks of Talcott Parsons, and he says, it could be basically the two sentences, And then he would take 3 pages and say, well, basically say 3 sentences that you can, not in all cases, but in general. I have to be careful here because certain ideas are not so easily translatable. But as a first approximation, you can make these things accessible if you want to, if you're committed to it. And as a good teacher, you should be committed to it. And also, as a person of the left, you should be committed to it. Bernie was theory-free. He was theory-free. No highfalutin theory with Bernie. But that was one of his strong points. He was able to articulate in very simple, accessible language what's wrong here.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I think that his manner of speaking and his language use, this lack of highfalutin theory, it's one of the things that endeared him to so many people. He certainly felt like people would think he's one of us.
Yes. The one thing, Bernie, as I said, he had the track record, he had the platform, he didn't personalize it, but the other thing was definitely, okay, this is a septuagenarian Jew from Brooklyn, an alien being for 95% of America.
Alien being.
He's an alien being. But exactly what you just said, they felt he was one of us because he spoke our language. Now, the truth of the matter is, Trump did the same thing. But what did Trump do? He goes to a rally, I guess it's in Illinois, and he starts talking. It was the hometown of the famous golfer of my generation, Arnold Palmer. And he starts talking. He said, oh, I knew Arnie. He had the biggest, you-know-what. I saw him once coming out of the shower. And you could say, well, Finkelstein, is that what you mean about talking like the people? And it's true. We have to be honest about that. That's another aspect of the people. And Trump tapped into it, and he said, I know I shouldn't say this around ladies, but of course all the ladies in the audience just loved it, And the thing is, that's a very important insight. Trump and Bernie both recognized you have to reach the people. Trump tried to reach it by the salacious side of the human psyche. And Bernie tried to reach it by their economic interests. They smiled at Arnold Palmer's penis, but they also smiled at Medicare for all. They both had the same objective to reach the people, but it was a very different modus operandi for reaching the people. It's a complicated question of politics. Let's say you asked yourself the question, what differentiated a speaker like Adolf Hitler from a speaker like Martin Luther King? They're both appealing to emotion. There's no question about that. Neither of them is appealing to reason and facts. Each of them is trying to resonate to someone's emotional core. And the question is, does that delegitimize what Martin Luther King was doing? Should he have just been appealing to reason and facts, or, to use the term that you understand, are they both just demagogues? Are they both just demagogues? I forgot, I guess it was Plato who makes the distinction between a rhetorician, and I forgot the contrasting term, but a rhetorician is, for Plato, it's a demagogue. So you're both using the strategy of appealing to emotion, not appealing to your rational faculty. And is that legitimate for a person of the left? The exemplar of the person of the left, the kind of our philosopher king, is Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky did demonstrate an interesting fact about, so to speak, human nature. He would speak for 2 or 3 hours at a time. And you know what? People stayed and listened. Their capacity for a reasoned argument is much larger than is sometimes thought. I think you know the story that huge crowds came out, stood on their feet for hours listening to the Lincoln-Douglas debates in our American history. And they were ordinary people, from the town who are for hours and hours standing on their feet. So the human capacity for listening to reasoned, factually based argument is much bigger than is sometimes thought. I remember, this is not in any way to denigrate a man of such, I always describe Professor Chomsky in my mind as somebody, a stupendous force of nature and an indefatigable force for good. When I say indefatigable, you have no notion of the amount of time this man invested in email, in meetings with activists, in traveling here, there, and yon. I remember once he was going to China, and then he was going to Brazil. And his wife said, I'm not going to China and then Brazil. That's not going to happen. She had to drop out of this particular journey. So I will never say anything to ever in any way diminish him, a person of just once in a millennium distinction. But I remember he wanted I can't stand to listen to Martin Luther King because he wants facts. He wants argument. I remember, I won't name the person, a very prominent person. He was attending a meeting of the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, Middle East Studies Association. And there were 3 panelists on each side. One was Bernard Lewis, who was the foremost authority in the Middle East and blindly supportive of Israel. The second was the literary editor of the New Republic. His name was Leon Wieseltier, also a fanatical supporter of Israel. And I don't remember the third. And the other side was Edward Said, who was the spokesperson for the other side. Christopher Hitchens, and I forgot maybe it was 2 and 2. Maybe it was 2 and 2. And one of the persons spoke, and I remember, and he was very eloquent, complete mastery of the English language.
Guessing it was Hitchens.
I won't say, but I remember Chomsky saying, I didn't attend the event, but I remember Professor Chomsky saying to me afterwards, quote, I don't see how he could persuade anyone. Because there is something to be said there, that you have the hope that rationally you can persuade people. But I don't think through just verbal dexterity, you can actually persuade people. Martin Luther King had a very different style than Malcolm X. Malcolm X, some of his arguments were crazy, especially in his Nation of Islam years. But he didn't rely on verbal pyrotechnics. He did not. He tried to make arguments,
I'm curious to hear what you think about Christopher Hitchens. I read 2 of his books in high school. I read God Is Not Great, and then his book on the Elgin Marbles. And the latter was, for me, an eye-opening look at a fascinating topic. And the first ushered me into a couple years of militant atheism. But I don't really know. I mean, I'm not as tuned into his debates and some of the other things he's done, so I'm curious just how you think about him.
Christopher Hitchens, when he did his about face, his volte-face after 9/11.
What was that about face that he did?
Oh, I guess it's time. It's time. Christopher Hitchens was considered a person on the left. He was kind of one of several characters who always was representing the left in public. There was a second character named Alexander Cockburn, a brilliant journalist. Christopher Hitchens, Edward Said. These were what you might call the celebrities of the left. And after 9/11, Hitchens switched sides. He became a right-winger. And I actually wrote a long essay on Christopher Hitchens. My impression was that there was never any deep commitment. There was no, as they call it, moral core to him. Because if you have a moral core, let's say you realize you're wrong about something. It's very agonizing because you've invested your whole being in a cause. And then to discover you're wrong is an agonizing experience. And the normal process is it's incremental. You don't just throw everything away, because that's effectively to say your whole life was a waste. Your whole life was an illusion. So you may say, I'm no longer a radical, now I'm a liberal, which is what most young people, let's say, who went through the 60s, they were radical or imagined themselves to be radical. I'm not going to be in any way disparaging. You're young, and you imagine yourself to be radical. And then when you get older, you get a little more conservative. That's the normal evolution, but you still preserve certain of your radical beliefs, convictions, you care about humanity and so on and so forth. But when somebody just goes from one end of the spectrum to the other, that's not serious. That's not serious. It means you never had any real commitment. I remember, I don't know if I should say his name. Okay, somebody who knew Christopher Hitchens very well. He said, Christopher Hitchens, whenever he walked into a room, he had only one goal, one objective, to become the center of attention. And that to me was him. He had his erudition as a political writer. Now, I'm not going to in any way disparage his knowledge of the English language, knowledge of Shakespeare and things like that. That's not my bailiwick, so I can't render judgment. But the politics, you know what his politics was? He would find 3 facts, arcane facts. Let's say he wants to write an essay about Pakistan, okay? So he'll come up with an arcane fact like, Pakistan means literally land of the pure. And then he'll come up with a second and a third, and then he'll write 10 pages. He just needs to plug in 3 facts, and then it's a verbal tapestry. It's a verbal tapestry. There's nothing there.
Very different from your work.
Yeah, there's nothing there. It's just words. Now, as I said, words are fun, and he could be fun to read. Okay? I'm not going to deny that. But he's not pretending to be, he's not Philip Roth. He's not writing literature. He pretends that this is political, but there's no content there. If you read his book, The Missionary Position,
it's a good title.
Yes, it was a good title by, what's her name?
Mother Teresa?
Yeah, Mother Teresa. My brain, my memory. Oh, God, please. Mother Teresa. There's nothing in the book. He has like a few pages analyzing a picture. You hear what I'm saying? A picture of her with some corrupt individuals. Just look at her face. Look at, this is not politics. Now, of course, politics could be fun. Trotsky was, I don't know the Russian, but he was Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionist, but mastery of what makes a great writer, mastery of simile, a mastery of metaphor, breathtaking. And it's just wonderful to read. Wonderful to read, but it's also rich in political content. He loved language, but he also was deeply immersed in politics. Somebody once said Trotsky was an egomaniac, for sure, but somebody once described, one of his comrades said, Trotsky is in love with his ego, but his ego is revolution. It was a very precise characterization of him. He's in love with his ego, but his ego is revolution. You couldn't separate the political from the personal. He was, So of course you could have fun with language, and Trotsky was hilarious, not intentionally, in putting down other people. You can have fun, but it's not political if it's just fun. For Christopher Hitchens, it was plugging in 3 facts and then this verbal tapestry that went on for pages. It was fun to read, but you walk away, what exactly did I learn here? Not really anything. It's like on the book you mentioned, God is Not Great. The writer, Alex Coburn, who was associated with Hitchens before they split after 9/11, he said, Hitchens thinks he's doing something so brave by attacking religion. And Coburn said, that battle was fought 500 years ago. It's not exactly courageous now to fight that battle in the West. Okay? But then he also said, he said, the left has always had a friendly relationship with people in religion. We've seen them as allies sometimes. Sometimes there's disagreement. But, you can't imagine the history of the left, say, in the recent years, let's say during the wars in Central America, during the Reagan administration. There was a phenomenon, forgotten now, called liberation theology. And liberation theology was priests and pastors who took up the struggle of the poor. Really, those folks, you couldn't dismiss them. You couldn't mock them. I don't see any, my parents were militant atheists for reasons which, to me are perfectly they were not militant. They were angry.
Yeah. Given their past.
My mother's father was fanatically religious, fanatical. My mother said he was more religious than any rabbi. And she told the story that when the Nazis invaded in 1939, they were of the Polish middle class. And she said they had the money to leave. They could have left. And she said, my father, she said, he was so stupid. He was so stupid. He was so stupid, but she loved him to death. She revered him. He said God would never let this happen to the Jewish, nothing bad to happen to the Jewish people. So they stayed. So my mother never forgave that. So she had no tolerance whatsoever for religion. I even remember her last week. She was in bed. A friend of mine, I can name him, Evan Siegel, and his wife, Mina, who was a Baha'i from Iran. They came to see her. They knew her. And she approached my mother and said something about God. My mother was already like 90 pounds. She had a horrible cancer. The cancer ate up her whole face. Her whole face was blood and boils. It was like a science fiction movie. And even in her last days, she went like this, "Get away from me with God!"
Scared me there.
"Get away from me with God!" They didn't want to hear anything about God. But, for me, respecting my parents as I always do, and their life experience. I never quarreled with them about their life experience. They hated Germans. They hated Poles. Don't dare say a positive word about them. My father hated Germans. Hated Germans. Not Nazis. Don't get me, that's the distinction that was very precious to my father. Once he read a book, it was on the Nazi Holocaust, and he recommended the book to me. He said, "Norman, you should read this book." I said, "Why do you like it?" He said, "I like the fact that they didn't talk about Nazis and distinguish them from Germans. They were all Nazis, period, full stop." I would never quarrel with my parents about those things. Never. On the other hand, I'm now approaching an age when they already died. They died at 74. So I'm allowed my own opinions at this point in my life. And my view is, the older you get, the more you realize life's a complete mystery. what is it? You know? Are we all just, by virtue of evolutionary biology, are we fixed because we have choice? Has it just been fixed in our minds to believe that there's some purpose? So I reach the point in my life where I figure everybody has his, her way of trying to make sense of this thing called life. And if some people, they can sort out, make some sense of it through religion, who am I to tell them they're wrong? You know, everybody's kind of fabricating some sense to this thing that doesn't have any sense in and of itself. So, and I'll tell you the truth, Muslim young people, they're so respectful. They're so kind. They're so decent. And I find that with my African-American students. I know it's going against stereotypes and they'll make me sound like a liberal, which I'm not, or politically correct, which I'm not. But I've always found my most respectful students by far are African-American males, by far. You know why? Religion. Because if they made it to college, it's almost always because they went to church. They were
Really?
Yes, they were church going. And the church had a very positive impact. I'll tell you a story. I think I mentioned earlier my student Luke in Sindora still, the one who's now up for a Fulbright. And there are details I can't reveal, but he had some serious problems. And one day after class, he came over to me and he said, "Professor Finkelstein, will you be my mentor?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I started teaching in the 80s, 88. Nobody had ever asked me. I was such an audacious thing to ask. I said, "Sure, of course." And I said, "Okay, so what do you want to do with your life?" And he said, "I want to be a lawyer." I said, "Okay, what are your majors?" He said, "Business and psychology." I said, "Forget that. That's out. You want to be a real lawyer? You're going to take philosophy and English. Philosophy teaches you how to reason. English teaches you how to write. And if you want to be a lawyer, it's two things. It's reasoning, logic, and writing, composition."
That strikes me as really good advice.
So I said, well, I get an email from him 2 weeks later. I changed my majors, English and philosophy. To fast forward, he's now gotten, and he had serious problems. I can't respect for him. I won't go into it, but serious problem. 23 straight A's. 23 straight A's. And now a Fulbright finalist. So here's a funny story, a little self-effacing, but who cares? So I said, "You know, Lukinson, what you did is just breathtaking. Your turnaround. I've never seen anything like it." He's studying medieval literature with a fervor and a passion. And I said, "It's like a miracle." And he said to me, "Well, I attribute it to," and what do you think I'm waiting for him to say?
You.
You. And you know what he said?
Huh.
God.
Ah.
He's very active in church. God. And that's my way of saying it served a positive force in his life. How can I begrudge it? How can I be, like those bi-coastal elites, those secular bi-coastal elites who look down their nose at religion and religious people. How could I do that? You know? Now, my mother would say, religion's stupid. Once there was a door-to-door salesman who came to our home, and he had a box, and he was selling some wares. Before internet, there were people who called door-to-door salesmen. And he rings our doorbell. My mother says, yes, what do you want? And he said, he's selling Bibles. My mother said, Bibles? Shove it up your ass. No tolerance, but I'm going. It's not just tolerance. Tolerance means you accept it even though you don't like it. It's not just tolerance. It's more than tolerance. It's a kind of humble recognition. I don't have the answers. I can't pretend to know the answers to the bigger questions about the meaning and purpose, if there is a meaning and purpose to life. So I'm not going to, you can be firm in your belief. I remember Professor Chomsky was asked, do you believe in afterlife? What do you think? And he just said very matter-of-factly, he said, no, I believe it's all over and all gone, and that's that, So you have the right to the conviction. But I think, John Stuart Mill says, you always have to leave a place in your mind for doubt that you might be wrong, because we are fallible creatures. And once you admit to your fallibility, then you have to admit that you could be wrong on this, that, or the other. There's never certainty. So you have a right to your convictions, for sure, and you can be emphatic about your convictions, but I think you should always leave a space for doubt. I remember one thing my mother said, which I keep, now that I'm getting to the end of life's journey. I remember she said, I think the spirit lives after you die. After you die. Wow, coming from such a hardened racist, atheist, for her to say that, And it's not something to get indignant about. You see, that was the thing Alex Coburn said. It was like a conversation between people of the left who are religious and not religious. It was like a friendly conversation. You don't have to do what Hitchens did, to mock, to treat with contempt, to affect saying you must be an idiot if you believe things. You know who used to do that? George Carlin, the comedian. Yeah. That was the one place where I disagreed with him. He was so contemptuous. People can be brilliant and still have religious belief. It doesn't make you stupid. Was Newton stupid? Ramanujan, the great Indian mathematician, he was absolutely certain God planted every single thought in his mind. How'd you do it? How'd you figure this out? Well, he said God. Is he dumb? But that was Hitchens' attitude. Anybody who believed in God, anyone who believed in religion, had to be an idiot. No, they're not idiots. Sorry, there are a lot of people I know, devout Muslims, who are brilliant physicists. They know more about science than you, Mr. Hitchens. They're not stupid. They're not stupid. It's just not correct.
Speaking of people you may think are stupid, what was the story with Destiny and Lex Fridman?
Lex Fridman originally wanted me on with Destiny. I said, that's not going to happen. He then contacted me about 3 weeks later, and he said, how about coming on with Benny Morris? I said, fine. Benny Morris is serious. I think his politics are horrible, but he's serious. And then he said, well, it would be Morris and Destiny. And at that point, I faced a dilemma, which is if I said no, it would appear as if I were afraid to be on with Morris, which I'm not afraid to be. But if I said yes, then I'm burdened with this other person. I think I could just ignore him. And I said, well, if he's coming on with that other person, then I should have somebody also, and that would be Muin Rabbani. So it was a matter of, obviously, curiosity, why Fridman was so determined that I would be on with Destiny. Now, you might say for broad public interest, but the debate between me and Benny Morris would already have a lot of public interest, especially during the high. So why was he so determined? And that question remains. That question remains.
Do you have any
Nope.
idea?
Nope. But when I was told that that person called Destiny was paid and coached. Now, I've made the allegation already. I've said what I just told you. And then that thing called Destiny went on and said, he's looking for a libel lawyer. But nothing ever, obviously, I think the very last thing he wanted to do was litigate this. Because discovery would be a very uncomfortable thing for him. I've already said publicly that I know that he was paid. I know, but I never said the Mossad. I said, quote, an Israel advocacy group, because that's what I was told. And he was paid, quote, a handsome sum. I was also told, quote, that they rehearsed with him for several weeks to prepare him for the occasion.
I'd like to get right into your upcoming book. So Gaza's Grave Diggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. And I think that a good place to start, especially for our listeners who aren't familiar with your background, is to hear that context about your parents and your family's history with the Holocaust.
That's one of those standard questions where does one begin? First of all, just the factual background, okay? My mother and father were born in Warsaw. My father, I understand, I don't know the details, I understand that he owned a lumber mill. His father owned a lumber mill. I know that he had a sister and a brother, but I don't know anything more than that. I never asked him. If you asked me why, and I never asked my mother, the answer is very simple. It was fear. I didn't think I would be able to emotionally handle the outpouring of grief that would result from me asking those questions. I can be persistent, but this is a case where I didn't want to be persistent because I was so afraid of what would come out. So I know he had a brother and a sister. My mother had 2 sisters and a brother. I know that because pictures. My mother had an aunt who lived in the United States. So my mother's mother sent pictures to her sister. So they survived the war. Of my father, there was nothing. and there were no relatives. Everybody was killed except on my mother's side, my mother, and my father's side, my father. Everybody else was exterminated. So they grew up in Warsaw. They were in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1939 or 1940. They started building the wall in the ghetto in Warsaw in 40 until 1943. 1943 was what's called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And then the survivors, now my parents were not in the uprising. I always want to make that clear because I don't want to misrepresent who they were. I think my mother's sister was part, but I don't know the details, never asked. After the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the estimates are about 20 to 40,000 Jews survived, and they were deported to Majdanek. They were all deported to Majdanek concentration camp. Now it seems, I don't know the details, my mother knew my father before the war. And one vivid recollection I have was my mother saw my father's sister in Majdanek. I guess the women were separated from the men, so my father didn't see her, but my mother saw her. And every long while at home, my father would get very stern, erect. His eyes would narrow, and he would turn to my mother and say, "Tell me what she looked like." It was his way of seeing her, his sister. And my mother said she had a shock of blonde hair, and she was wearing white boots, and she was very beautiful. You know, that may be exaggerated, but that was what I was told. And then my mother was transferred to 2 slave labor camps, and she was liberated by the Russians. My father was according to my mother, I don't know these things. When I wrote my first book, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict, of course I'm dedicating it to my parents. And I wrote, to the memory of my father, Auschwitz concentration camp, memory of my mother, Majdanek concentration camp. And I showed the dedication to my mother before I published it. And she said, "Your father was in 7 concentration camps." So I don't know the details, but he ended up in Auschwitz, and he was on the Auschwitz death march. Anything else, I think he was an electrician in Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was some of the camps were work camps and death camps. Auschwitz was a work camp and a death camp. So I remember when we were growing up, whenever there was problems with electricity, I remember it was much cruder back then. So you were always afraid of getting electrocuted. That was very real. My father would take a pair of pliers and just put it right in. Dad, what are you doing? Where are your rubber gloves? He was absolutely fearless. If you survive being an electrician in Auschwitz, you know how to do anything. Same thing with health. My father was one of those, typical Jewish father. Gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning. No alarm clocks. Alarm clocks were a luxury back then. And we didn't, it was a fancy, like color TV alarm clock.
Yeah, really.
So, but, workers didn't need alarm clocks. He just had the internal clock. So he gets up at 6 and off to work, and there was no question about him oversleeping. That never happened, literally, I can tell you, it never happened. And he worked 6.5 days a week. On Saturdays, he worked till 2 o'clock. Once he came home, believe it or not, he had 106 fever, 106. Well, for that,
Wow.
that was like a death sentence. And my mother, we don't call doctors. Even though that back then, doctors made house visits. You didn't go to the hospital. The doctor came to you. No hospital. She would say, Norman, get this. Richard, get that. Get that. Get it. Because by the war, they learned how to survive. They knew exactly what to do for everything. They were like doctors. Mm-hmm. And she was absolutely confident. She brought down the temperature in the morning. He was close to normal. And you know what? What am I going to say? He went to work. You don't miss a day of work. Yeah. He went to work.
Now, is that the immigrant mindset, or is that?
Oh, no, I think that was being Jewish, a Jewish worker. I mean, it's a Jewish ethic, I believe that. I believe, cultures have impacts. And it was, but I'm sure it's other things, it's a mixture, obviously, but that's a component. And then the thing that's hard for people to understand, I think, is when we grew up, nobody was interested, Jews. No one was interested in the Holocaust. None. There was no interest at all. It was several reasons. One, it's after the war. All the obstacles to Jewish success have now collapsed. They're disappeared. Jews are going places. They're going places. They don't want to look back. They don't want to look back at a sorrowful chapter like the extermination of the Jews. They're looking forward. They're out, and I'm not being in the least bit hyperbolic. They're out to conquer the world. And you ready for this? They did. That's just a fact. I've told the story 100 times. I'll tell it 101 times.
Please.
I went to, a public high school, James Madison High School. There was a time where 3 sitting senators were from my high school. Not even any private colleges, private schools had that. Current now Senate Minority Leader, before Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, my high school. Bernie Sanders, my high school. Norm Coleman, my high school. Judge Judy, my high school. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, my high school.
Wow.
Brace yourself for this. Not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, 6 Nobel laureates in physics, in economics, in biology.
Jewish?
All Jewish. All Jewish. All my high school. They set their sights to conquer the world, and they conquered it. They did. So, by the way, if you ever have your camera, come down to my high school, and you'll see the wall of celebrities, those who made it. You would be astonished. I'm astonished. Every once in a while I pass the high school, and when a friend is in town or a visitor, I come and show them. And you'd be astonished. The who's who of America. The who's who. My high school. So they don't want to look at the Holocaust. They were looking forward. We're going to conquer the world. Number 2, it may sound strange to hear you, may be strange to your ear now. It was an embarrassment to have passed through the Nazi Holocaust. Why? Because A, it was said that the Jews went like sheep to slaughter. Jews said that about themselves. Jews went like sheep to slaughter. And number 2, the assumption was, if you survived, you must have done something dirty. How else could you survive? I remember my late mother, she would always get very angry when people asked, in complete innocence, how did you survive? Because she thought it was a subtle dig.
Yeah, how brutal psychologically that must have been.
So I try to be objective about myself. I always traveled with a smart crowd, but I wasn't of their caliber. I was not. But I always wanted to be among them, they were very condescending, not nice people. Not nice people. You know, it's Cassius, the lean and hungry look. So ambitious. So ambitious. And that level of ambition, it yields achievement, but not nice people. Not nice. You know, but I traveled with them, hung out with them. Hung out meaning the library, reading books, not hanging out like a club. In any event, politics was in the air. This was the 1960s. And these were the smartest people going out there, the smartest. I didn't realize how smart. I thought they were just smart from my high school. I didn't realize they were smart by the standards of the whole country. I didn't. I had no concept of that. In any event, I could say without fear of contradiction, if you took a polygraph and put it on my wrist now, not one friend or parent of a friend, not one, ever asked my parents a single question about what they passed through. Never once. None. And I could say that straight through to high school, senior year. Never. There was no interest. There was no interest at all in the Nazi Holocaust. Things radically changed, beginning after the June 1967 war, but particular after, in the 1970s, I wrote a little book on the subject, The Holocaust Industry, in which I chronicle how this industry was created literally out of nothing. I mean, you'll be surprised, let's say, when Hannah Arendt writes her book, Ackman in Jerusalem. That was 1964. The book comes out. And you look at the bibliography. And she had an exhaustive bibliography. Do you know how many books in the English language in the Nazi Holocaust? Do you know how many books? 2. 2. It wasn't, and you know the famous story, you don't know it, I shouldn't say you know it. The greatest historian of the Nazi Holocaust is a fellow named Raoul Hilberg.
Raoul Hilberg.
Hilberg, Hilberg. And he wrote the foundational work. He effectively created the field called Holocaust Studies. The book is called The Destruction of the European Jews. The Destruction of the European Jews. His advisor at Columbia was a fellow named Franz Neumann, who was a great German sociologist, anti-fascist German sociologist. And when Hilberg approaches him and asks him, you know, I'm going to do a dissertation on the extermination of Jews. And Neumann replied to him, don't do it. You'll have no career. Because at that point in time, we're talking about the early 50s now, when Hilberg is a graduate student, it's after the war. And who is our main ally in Europe? Germany, West Germany. And mentioning the Holocaust was seen as being pro-communist because you're undermining our alliance with the Germans. Because the whole German, aside from Adenauer, who was the head of the German government, the chancellor, they were all ex-Nazis. Because if you were over the left, you went to the East Germany. If you stayed in the West, you're an ex-Nazi. So you can't bring up the Holocaust, which is another reason it wasn't mentioned. Because the only ones who talked about the Holocaust were the communists. So in order, it was said, to discredit the German government. That's what was said. You know, the communists talk about the Holocaust as a weapon to discredit the West German government. So if you talked about it, you were said to be a like a patsy of the communists. So being the son, in my case, son of Holocaust survivors was, can I use the term without evoking self-pity? It was kind of lonely. You never miss what you never had. But I never had any relatives. I never had an aunt, an uncle, a grandma, a grandpa. I never had any of that, which I think that's part of the reason I wasn't bar mitzvahed, because a bar mitzvah is where you invite relatives, and there was no relatives to invite. So my eldest brother had a celebration, but not the actual going to the synagogue and so forth. My middle brother, myself, we didn't even have the celebration. We had nothing, It was hard because that was sort of like the equivalent among WASPs of a coming out party, where the bar mitzvahs were basically to flaunt wealth. You made it. You judged the bar mitzvah back then. Where was it? A fancy room or a basement type room? How many couples were invited? Did you have matchboxes with initials on them? All these silly things. But I didn't have any of that. And I would say I was kind of popular. At that age, I was good looking. No point in being self-effacing. I was good looking, and I was gregarious. And so it was humiliating not to have the bar mitzvah, because it was such a critic. It wasn't like you became a man. It was a social status. And so I was very low on the pecking order, because I didn't have the social pecking order, because I didn't have the bar mitzvah. And in the end, it straightened me as a person. It made me much more immune to my public reputation. I got tough. And the other aspect of it was, because of my parents' experience during the war, their politics were very unusual. First of all, you could never, to the last day in my home, you could never say a word critical of Stalin. Impossible. Because my parents looked at the world through their experience during World War II. It was the Russian Red Army that defeated the Nazis, and that's all they cared about. Which, again, like my mother's disdain of religion, my father was as emphatic. What he would say? By a coincidence, my father was in Auschwitz, and then on the Auschwitz death march with a guy named Yisrael Gutman. And they were both in the Zionist youth movement called Hashomer Hatzair. In 1948, Gutman, who was my father's closest friend, he heads off for Israel. I should say Hashomer Hatzair was very left-wing, pro-Soviet. My father and my mother, they head to the United States. And Israel Gutman eventually became one of the directors of Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Museum. And later in life, Gutman adapted his political beliefs and became very anti-Soviet. And my father, who liked him a lot, they went through the war together. They went through the death march together. They were in the DP camp together. They were in Hashomer Hatzair together. And my father would just shake his head and say, when he became very anti-Russian, another traitor. another traitor. It was one of the things I deeply respected about my parents. They liked money. They liked money. And there was a lot of money to be made by being a Holocaust survivor in the 70s and 80s. Because my parents were the real deal. You know, most of the people who say the Holocaust survivor is just complete nonsense, it's complete fabrication. But my parents, and everybody knew they were the real deal. They were very indignant when anyone else pretended to be. And so, you know, my mother was ruthless. What do you mean you were in the Holocaust? You have no idea what we went through. They were real. It wasn't a confection. It wasn't a concoction. It wasn't an exaggeration. So there was a lot of money to be made. But in that era, the Holocaust was being weaponized. These are things you just couldn't possibly know because it's a totally different era. There was this large numbers of Jews who were in the Soviet Union. And then this campaign began to free Soviet Jewry. And it was claimed that the Russians were persecuting the Jews in Russia the same way as the Nazis were persecuted the Jews. And so the Holocaust was weaponized against the Soviet Union. And so if you wanted to make the money, you had to talk about how horrible the Russians are. You had to denounce the Russians. And you had to talk about freeing Soviet Jewry. My parents, there was no way. Give them, I mean this, and they like money. You give them $10 million, and they wouldn't say a word against the Russians. They were loyal. I don't agree with a lot of what they said. I told you I didn't agree with their hatred of the Germans. I want to just qualify that. I want the full picture. I did have a good friend who was half German. He was half Armenian, half German. His name is Cyrus Wieser. He's now a successful professor. He may have retired already, I don't know. And I once brought him over to the house. And afterwards, my mother, at the end when he was leaving, my mother whispered in his ear, "I know you're half German, it's okay." Which for her, well, yes. My father could not say that. My father hated the Poles, as did my mother, hated religion. When Gutman, who I mentioned earlier, came to New York, and my father was taking him around, and Gutman wanted to see St. Patrick's Cathedral. My father took him to the cathedral, would not go in. Their memories of Poland were so bitter. And, you know, because the Catholic holidays were also the days when they attacked the Jews.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So he wouldn't go in. On the other hand, facts are facts. The attitude of Jews to Poles was different than the attitude of Jews to Germans. Germans, there was a hatred. Poles, there was a contempt. You know, all the Polak jokes, always looking down. It wasn't, you know, when you hate somebody, part of it is a respect. There's a undercurrent of respect. There was like the evil genius. But with the Poles, it was just stupid. My mother was stupid Poles. The only thing she respected, she said the Polish pianists were the best. She knew music very well. She was very cultured. She was president of her class and president of her school. She then went to Warsaw University, where she studied mathematics.
They were great mathematicians and logicians as well.
Right. But you can imagine Jewish women studying at mathematics at Warsaw University, no small achievement. She, as I said, it wasn't hatred, it was contempt. Contempt. However, her two last friends in life, her two last friends were Poles. And the last was the woman, her caretaker. Her caretaker. Obviously, it was unthinkable that my brothers and I would put them in a home or something that's not within the range of possibility. We found her a caretaker. She was Polish, very Polish, Polish Catholic. And my mother's last words, she loved her. She loved her. Her last words to my brother Richard, who she spoke to the night before she died, she knew she was going to die, and she had resolved. She had reconciled herself to it. Her last words were, "Make sure you take care of Clara." That was her name, Clara. And you know, it was an interesting end. You look down on them, you hate them. Not hate, again, it's not hate, it was contempt. But at the end, Clara was, she says, Clara's like a sister to me. So life is, you know, full with contradictions. You know the stories. How many men in the, you know, the most famous segregationists in the American South had fathered children from blacks, and actually, what was his name? Strom Thurmond, who was the most famous segregationist from the American South, probably after George Wallace. And he apparently took care of her. And she considered herself part of the family, and they eventually, I think, it was a recent story, like the last 10 years, they accepted her. You know? So life is filled with all sorts of contradictions, which theories aren't adequate to. I think it was Hegel who said how gray is theory and how green is life. The theories don't adequately account for human nature, which is very elusive. So that was what it was like growing up. Never asked any questions. Never asked any questions. The one person who inadvertently asked questions was the Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! I knew her a long time ago, and she visited my home. And she interviewed my mother. I thought it was a very good interview she did. But then she came to do a second interview, which wasn't as successful. And she's talking to my mother, and at one point, she just was doing what an interviewer is supposed to do, an interlocutor is supposed to do. And she said to my mother, "So, what happened to your family?" And my mother turned her head like this, and you knew, don't talk about it. So Amy tried to change the subject, put it on a more upbeat note. So she said, "What was it like when the war, you were liberated? What was it like?" And Amy had a smile on her face, and she said, "It must have been the happiest day of your life." She said it like that. And my mother looked at her, and she said, "Happiest day of my life. It was the most horrible day in my life." Amy, understandably, was utterly perplexed. And she said, "Why horrible?" And my mother said, "Because it was the first moment I realized I was all alone in the world." Because when you were in the Nazi Holocaust, everything is about survival. I remember I once asked Raoul Hilberg, the historian who I met. He was an extremely conservative, right-wing swore by the Wall Street Journal, but was so kind and generous and supportive of me more than anyone else. In fact, his praise of me was more unstinting than Professor Chomsky's. He said, my place in history is secure. As a writer of history, my place is secure, that I paid a big price for my beliefs.
This was after your first book?
No, it was during my 10-year battle.
Nice.
But he also praised the Holocaust industry, believe it or not. And he told me, believe me, we weren't on friendly terms. I was always terrified. I'm going to say something wrong and I'm going to lose Hilberg and then everything's going to be horrible. So stay away from him, stay away. But when the Holocaust industry came out, he said, look, I went through the same documents as Finkelstein. He's correct. He said, in fact, Finkelstein's conclusions are conservative. And the Holocaust Museum and Elie Wiesel, they were so angry. He said, every 3 weeks I get a call from Elie Wiesel asking me to take my blurb off your book, off Finkelstein's book. And he refused. He refused. He was very cantankerous, cranky, very right-wing, but he believed in truth.
Integrity.
Yeah, total integrity. Total integrity. It moves me to this day. In any case, I once asked Hilberg, okay, of course, 99% of you surviving is just luck, but were there any qualities that gave you a little edge in terms of surviving? And he said, quickness of mind. You have to constantly make quick decisions. Should I go to the left? Should I go to the right? Should I hide? Should I this? Constantly your mind has to be very nimble in tight situations. And that was my mother. I described how when my father was ill, Norman, get this. She suddenly becomes so focused on the task that needs to be done. So that's how my mother survived the war. Of course, 99% is luck, but 1% was that intense focus. So she didn't realize she was alone until liberation. So it was the most horrible day of her life. And I imagine, because it's perfectly pertinent now, it's the same thing with the people of Gaza. Go here, go there, go there, go there, go there. For 15 months. For 15 months. They're going here, going there, going there, going there. And now they rushed in large numbers to the north. And they suddenly realized there's nothing there. You're hearing reports now coming out. A lot of them are returning back to the south, to their tent in the south, because there's nothing there. And, people are saying the resilient people of Gaza, and they're marching to the north. And I'm thinking to myself, I wish that were true, but I believe it's only now going to begin to sink in. There's nothing left. Like with my mother. You suddenly realize, because the people of Gaza, it was just for 15 months, survival. Survival. Many people were displaced 4 times, 5 times. Go to the south, then go to Rafah, and go to Al-Masari, go here. And now it sinks in. So I'm much more skeptical about how long the exhilaration is going to endure before a deep despair sets in.
Gaza's gravediggers first came up in a conversation you and I had off the air over the summer. And I don't even think you used the title then, but you told me that you were writing a new book. And I said, well, maybe we'll talk about it in a future conversation. And you said, I'm not so sure about that. It's a really technical book. Now, you've written a lot on Gaza, on Israel and Palestine. What is the occasion for a new book now, and why an inquiry into corruption in high places?
First of all, and again, this is not false modesty. I know my strengths, and I know my weaknesses. I know my talents and my gifts, and I know the areas where I lack any talent. I once tried to sing a song in public, and my publisher said after I did it was an African-American spiritual, some come crippled, some come lame, some come walking in Jesus' name. Bear the burden in the heat of the day. I needed that because the point was we all have to bear burdens. Some come crippled, some come lame, some come walking in Jesus' name. Bear the burden. Paul Robeson, obviously. In any case, my publisher said to me, Norm, keep your day job. I know my strengths and I know my weaknesses. I'm not a writer. You know what? Writing for me is one thing. And I'm serious. It's cathartic. Otherwise, I would implode. I get so angry at the lies, this barrage, this relentless barrage of lies. One of the things that's different about the Israel-Palestine conflict than, say, South Africa with apartheid. One of the big differences, obviously there are many differences, but from my vantage point, one of the big differences, the struggle for apartheid begins, I'm not talking about South Africa, it begins here, the struggle against apartheid. It begins in the 1960s, 70s. It's after the civil rights movement. So it's impossible to defend apartheid. It's a lost cause. So the South Africans made no intellectual attempt to defend apartheid. Here I'm talking about. You know, they would say they were anti-communist, obviously, and they were a bastion of Western civilization in Africa, and there were all the minerals in Africa, so they're an important ally. They would try to make strategic arguments, or it was a modern industrial society, so they made economic arguments, but they never tried to defend it intellectually. The Israel-Palestine conflict, it's a ceaseless barrage by a very sophisticated propaganda machine with a lot of, not conscripts, they're not conscripts, they're volunteers. The whole of the American Jewish intelligentsia. They felt they were doing their share for the cause after, during World War II, the American Jews having done nothing for, that was the claim that was made. American Jews let the Jews die in the Holocaust. They did nothing. Some of it's true, some of it's not true, some of it's exaggerated, but beside the point. So they felt like they were doing something for the cause of Israel, something for the cause of Jews. So they all volunteered. And it's a ceaseless, relentless proliferation of propaganda. Nonsense, different levels of lies, but all told lies. And so it's a full-time business trying to counter it. And that became my life's vocation. I'm called, rightfully I think, I'm called a forensic scholar. I go at it like Columbo, except I'm not looking for a smoking gun. I'm looking for errors in logic, reasoning, and so forth. errors, of course, of evidence, misrepresentations, falsifications of evidence. And so, and the other thing is, it's such a relentless proliferation of lies, bald-faced lies. And I do believe in truth. I do believe in truth. So I get so angry. You may know the story, you may not know the story. Professor Chomsky, his teeth were constantly being worn down.
I didn't know this.
Oh, it's a famous story, but from a different generation. His teeth were so they were trying to figure out, what is it? Why is he constantly, what's doing with his teeth? So they went to doctors, and the doctors would say, tell Carol, his wife, to observe him closely. And she said she would look at him because they thought maybe it's in his sleep. While he's sleeping, he's grinding his teeth. Maybe it's in his sleep. No, it wasn't that. And then one morning, an epiphany, a revelation. You know when he was grinding his teeth?
When?
Reading the New York Times.
That's a good story.
It's also true. And I'm kind of the same way. I mean, I'm not Noam Chomsky, but it really becomes physical, this disgust.
You couldn't watch the news last time we spoke.
Yes, that's true. I still don't. So I know it's almost infantile. People play these computer games. I've never played a computer game. I know it's hard to believe I've never played a computer game. But it's like, it's this kind of imaginary victory when I'm on the computer and I'm exposing the lies. And it's like, I got you. I have to do that or I'd go mad. I'd go around walking constantly in a fury at the lies. And so, because the lies have consequences, it's not just an intellectual game. I'm not capable of that level of intellectual abstraction that is higher mathematics. The purer it is, the more irrelevant it is, and it's almost pride at how irrelevant it is. No, for me, there are real world consequences of the lies. It's human suffering. And so I do it as a form of catharsis. It's a form of therapy, a form of catharsis. And so I wouldn't call it writing. Writing is, you love the craft of writing. No, I do it from a political conviction and a political commitment. And I did follow very closely what happened in the last 16 months since October 7th. Reading the Times was physically insupportable, unbearable. There was a time when I was posting, I've never been into social media, but I have a wonderful friend and comrade, Sana Qasim, who handles the social media. And I was responding to the Times' lies on an almost daily basis. And then it occurred to me, you know what, nobody reads the Times anymore. I'm wasting my time with them. So I started to write more comprehensively on the lies. And then I focused on issues which were important, I felt. The claim about rape, Hamas rape, on October 7th. The claim, this is a little bit more elusive for your listeners, but on January, I think it was 26th, I can't say for sure, I think so, January 26th, 2024, the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the world, found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. And that was, as victories go, it was a victory we savored. And then along comes the president of the court. Her name was Joan Donahue from the United States. She had already stepped down from the court. Her term of office ended. She went on British BBC program called Hard Talk. And she's interviewed on Hard Talk. And she said, there's a big misunderstanding. We never said that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. Myself, where did that come from? Where did that come from? And, most people say, who cares what she said? I said, no. I care about what she said. I care about what she said. And I sat down and I wrote a very long chapter of the book, going through line by line what the documentary record showed. A friend of mine, Ayman Haddad, is translating it into Arabic, the whole book, and he was on this chapter, and last night I was talking to him. So I said, so what do you think? He said, it's very tedious, it's repetitive, but it's irrefutable.
That's high praise.
I don't know. My publisher, who's a wonderful, wonderful guy, Colin Robinson, he said to me, Norman, please, when you're in public, don't say the book is boring. But, I'll tell you, my public life, I had no career. I never had a job. You're looking at a Jew who was never employed. Very, very unusual. Jews have a very strong work ethic. Mm-hmm. It's kind of...
You're an unconventional person.
But I had no job. I had none. It's hard for me to sometimes digest. I pass, because until fairly late, hope springs eternal. But I was always, the most I ever had was adjuncting. And adjuncting is you're hired from semester to semester at a sub-minimum wage. And if you're hired for 2 semesters, and that's an if already, it's only 28 weeks a year. And the rest of the time you have nothing. I never had work. I was an adjunct. But my career in my role as a forensic scholar, it began in 1984. I was still a graduate student, or I should say I had already left. I wasn't going to finish my PhD after my exams. But then I became involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. No point in going into that now. And a book came out, and it was called From Time Immemorial.
Joan Peters?
Yes, by Joan Peters. And it was considered, as it was called by Barbara Tuchman, who was a very revered historian at the time. She called the book, she called the book a historical event in itself. And it was said by others, noted people, Saul Bellow, Barbara Tuchman, Elie Wiesel, also the who's who of American Jewish intelligentsia. It was said it was going to revolutionize our understanding of the Middle East. And her basic thesis was very simple. Palestine was empty before the Jews came. The Jews came to Palestine, made the desert bloom, And then all these Arabs from neighboring countries surreptitiously entered Palestine and then pretended to be indigenous Palestinian. That's the whole thesis, very simple. And when the book came out, it was an event, a national bestseller, and Peters was on the lecture tour, and she was showing up everywhere. And I remember the people in my quote-unquote camp, our little camp, Edward Said and the notables, they all dismissed the book. It's just Zionist propaganda. Just Zionist propaganda. I, however, have been a Maoist, a follower of Chairman Mao of China. And when anyone criticized China, we would say, bourgeois propaganda. Bourgeois propaganda. And I was the worst. Self-righteous to the point of being obnoxious.
I'm surprised to hear you were a Maoist.
Yes, I was. But I was not what you would call an ignorant Maoist. There were people of high intellectual caliber who were supportive of the Chinese Revolution. My mentor, Paul Sweezy. There was a very brilliant economist in France, Charles Bettelheim, at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. I eventually studied with him. I was one of his students. So it wasn't as if it was a crude Maoism. It seemed to be a sophisticated one, but we dismissed all criticism as being, quote unquote, bourgeois propaganda. When Mao passed and his followers, they were called the Gang of Four. I still remember their names: Zhang Chongzhao, Yao Wenyuan, Jiang Jing, and Wang Kongwen. 50 years ago, I don't know Chinese, but I remember the names. And then things came out which were very unflattering to the Mao years. I don't think the picture is entirely correct that's been drawn, but there are facts I was egregiously wrong about. Not just wrong, egregiously wrong. I was physically devastated. I was bedridden for about 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
I understand that my professor in Paris, Bettelheim, went to the hospital for a month, shattered, destroyed. So when I started hearing it's just Zionist propaganda, my mind processed it as, it's just bourgeois propaganda. But a lot of the bourgeois propaganda turned out to be right. And I wasn't going to make, the expression, once bitten, twice shy. Mm-hmm. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It wasn't being wrong that was the worst part. Of course, that bothered me a lot. It was the humiliation that I had dismissed all the criticism from a very haughty perch. It's just bourgeois propaganda. You don't know what you're talking about. I know. I'm so much smarter because I had read everything in the subject, which I had. I was wrong. It was humiliating. That I had put everybody down and I had been proven to be wrong. I was embarrassed, humiliated, mortified. So I wasn't going to make that mistake again. And so when the Peters book came out, it had, the alleged author, Joan Peters, put it 1,852 footnotes. I went through every one. I went to the...
I've seen your dog-eared copy back at home.
Exactly. The New York Public Library Research Library on 42nd Street has I don't use it now, a magnificent collection of documents. I went there every day, sat down, went 1, 2, 3, 4, checking everything. And so my career began. I exposed it. I was credited. I was still a graduate student. I had exposed it.
But what exactly was the lie?
There were two aspects. Falsification of sources. They didn't say what she said they said. And there was, in the book, the core chapters were a demographic study, which purported to prove what her thesis. Now that demographic study was certified, its authenticity was certified at the end of the book by Philip Hauser, who was the head of population studies at the University of Chicago. Pretty formidable, redoubtable credentials. And you can imagine, I was very intimidated. He said what she wrote was true. And at the end of the book, there was an appendix with all of her calculations and all of her tables. So here were the chapters. I think it was chapters 14 to 16, but I could be wrong. I think it was chapters 14 to 16. And here were the tables. So she would make a statement. I turn to the back to the table, make a statement, table, check, 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 check. That's why the binding is completely broken, because I was checking. And then one night, which I still vividly recall, it's 1984, I suddenly realize one of the numbers is fake. One of the numbers is fake. And I got this frisson, this chill down my spine. And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I looked at it. It's wrong. That number is wrong. I lived in a little Raskolnikov type studio, tiny little studio in Washington Heights. I don't wish it on anybody, even my worst enemy.
I think it's a cozy place.
Oh, no, not what I have now.
Oh, okay.
This is when, no. Cozy was not, believe me. It may have been cozy for the cockroaches and the mice, but it was not cozy for me. I got up, it was like 1 a.m., and I'm, just shaking, and I'm going, I did it. And of course, when you achieve that, you want to share it. So, who'd have called? 1 a.m. So, I'm a Jewish boy. I called my mother. Mom, what? I did it. And she said, I'm so happy for you. What did you do? There was no way I could prove. Explain to her, I proved the demographic study was a hoax. And so, and that was, as I said, once bitten, twice shy. I believe in truth, and I didn't want to be humiliated. I couldn't accept just its bourgeois propaganda. And it was the same thing, we're talking about 50 years later. It was the same thing with Joan Donahue. Some people said, the American president, who said, we didn't say it was, and they said, who cares? No, I cared. And I sat down, tedious, repetitive, but I'm going to prove it. And I did the same thing with the current president of the International Court of Justice, Julia Sebutinde. That chapter, the chapter is 60 pages, single-spaced, just going through all of her dissents. And then there was a 35-page appendix by a very brilliant researcher, Gazan, by the way, who now resides in Doha, who demonstrates that she plagiarized 32.2% of her dissent from these hack Israel publications.
So what exactly is the story behind Julia Sebutinde? What did she claim, or what did she?
Okay. The story with Julia Sebutinde is that there were two cases pertaining to Palestine and Israel in the International Court of Justice. One case most people know, it was the case of whether or not Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And the second case was whether Israel was legally occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, or whether the occupation had become illegal. That was a separate case. These were two completely discrete, separate cases. And she kept writing these dissents. The court's finding it is plausibly genocide. The court finds that Israel is illegally occupying the Palestinian territories. And she kept writing these weird dissents where she's dismissing all the evidence, but giving evidence adduced by South Africa, but giving no explanation why. She's literally copying what the Israelis are saying in their defense, copying it. And then writing, in the case of whether the occupation is legal or not, writing this completely bizarre dissent that ran to like 28 pages. She said things like, most of you listeners will vaguely know. So the British issue what's called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and then the League of Nations gives the mandate for Palestine to the British. So that's 1917, then 1923. And she writes things in the dissent like, not exaggerating, she says, the British were given the mandate to establish a Jewish home in Palestine in order to assist refugees from the Holocaust. From the Holocaust. The mandate was 1923. What are you talking about? So I start to go through all of her dissents and all of her claims, and they were completely nutty. And I said there's only two possibilities, that she's either being blackmailed or bribed by Israel. Otherwise, this just doesn't make any sense.
And this might seem like a naive question, but is Israel regularly in the habit of blackmailing and bribing?
Look, I'm glad you asked that question. Obviously, judges are susceptible to political pressure. That's normal. We all know that. You have to live in a very
Gotta live under a rock.
you have to live under a rock not to recognize that. And we all know that judges are susceptible to pressures, and they're also susceptible to enticements. If you find the wrong ruling, certain doors are going to, if you make the wrong decision, certain doors are going to be closed to you, you know? Donald Trump, he's just straight out about it. You know, he's now saying that Egypt and Jordan have to take the people from Gaza. And he said yesterday, we give them a lot of money, they're going to do what we say. Very simple. And he's very, he's probably right.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to rule out those things. So when you ask me the question, is Israel in a habit? It's part of a bigger picture. I don't believe, I could be wrong, and I don't want to dispute it. I don't want anyone to take my word as written in stone. I don't think that's a usual practice among all countries. Practice the black arts. We know that. They have spies, they have agents, they resort to bribes, they resort to blackmail. no dispute about, and I don't want any way to be misconstrued like only Israel. But I do believe Israel has, it has made a large use, let's call it extracurricular use, of its intelligence agencies. For those of you who, some of you listeners will and some won't remember, after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, it created a huge stir when Israel carried out its first massive assault on Gaza.
Mowing the lawn.
Yes. These high-tech killing sprees. The United Nations Human Rights Council commissioned a person named Richard Goldstone from South Africa to investigate what Israel had done in Gaza. Goldstone was Jewish. He was a self-avowed Zionist. I'm not using the word as an epithet or as approval. I'm just saying he called himself a Zionist. He served in the as a representative among Israeli institutions like the Hebrew University. He had a place there. His daughter had done Aliyah. She lived in Israel. And he agreed to be in the Commission of Inquiry. And he wrote this 650, I think paragraph, I can't remember now, a huge report condemning what Israel did in Gaza. He came under ferocious attack by the American Jewish community. Alan Dershowitz compared him to Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz. Yeah, it was way over the top. But he wasn't the only one. I mean, it was a concerted, ferocious attack. He weathered the storm, but then on April 1st, I emphasize April 1st because in the United States that's April Fool's Day, where people perform pranks. On April 1st, in the Washington Post, there's an op-ed by Richard Goldstone. He retracted the report. He retracted. And he claimed it was based on new factual findings, but it wasn't true. There were no new factual findings. It's just not true. I go through the record very carefully in my book, Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom. And the assumption was, the quiet assumption was, those black arts, they found dirt on him or one of his family members. I did not believe it was him. He was a very respected judge, and doesn't mean that we don't all have skeletons in our closet. We do. He would have been careful, just because of his position. Not everybody in positions of power, recognize, as Elliot Spitzer, who was the state controller, I think, very smart guy. And he ended up being brought down because he was having sexual relations with not just high-class cool girls, but people who had associations with the mob. He may have been the state attorney general. And it was like, so stupid. You left yourself so open to blackmail. Dumb, 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 dumb. And his political career collapsed after that. But I thought Goldstone probably had clean hands. But I figured, you have a daughter. Maybe she had an affair. Maybe she had a child out of wedlock. And then the threats come from the Israeli intelligence agencies. And then it's, Daddy, please, please do what they say, do it. And so when it came out on April 1st, the initial reaction was, it's a prank. I couldn't believe it. The head of the South African delegation to the ICJ is a person named John Dugard, who's a very highly regarded international lawyer. I have had correspondence with him. I say we could call each other acquaintances. When he comes to New York with his wife, we meet. And I remember I contacted him because the Goldstone report was like the ICJ plausible genocide finding. It was a landmark. These are a victory at a very high place, okay? And then I told you when Joan Donahue said in April, we didn't find that, how angry I was. And when I read Goldstone retracted the report, I was so angry. And I wrote to Dugard and I said, something died in me today. And Dugard wrote back, same with me. Something died in me today. And then there are a whole series of other cases. There is the former chief prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda. And it was clear from the record, I wrote a whole book on it called I Accuse, that Bensouda was working for the Israelis, probably blackmailed by Israel. And there are other instances. So, you know, I don't claim that Israel has a monopoly on this particular black art, but this use of blackmail, I think Israel is maybe in a category all its own, especially its effectiveness. I mean, look who we're talking about. The current president of the International Court of Justice, the former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. These are high offices. And I do believe this. In the case of Joan Donahue, I don't think it was blackmail. It was simply careerism. Because she presided, she was the president of the ICJ when they found Israel plausibly committing genocide. Now that closes a lot of doors. It closes a lot of doors when she steps down as president because her term is over. And she had to open up those doors. And the way to open up those doors, you go on BBC Hard Talk and said, we never found that they were guilty of genocide. And that opens the door. I think it was pure careerism in her case. In the case of the whole rape claim about, October 7th, Hamas had weaponized rape as a weapon of war, used rape as a weapon of war. And that claim was first validated by Pramila Patten, and she was an appointee of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. In her case, I think she was just stupid. But there's another question. Okay, she's stupid. I think, you could say that. Not the brightest light in the circuit, not the sharpest tool in the shed. Sheryl Sandberg, she was the former chief operating officer of Meta. And I have no reason to doubt she's a very bright woman. She was top student in her economics class at Harvard, studied under Lawrence Summers. So, we're talking about serious business here. And she makes this after October 7th, she makes this documentary called Screams Before Silence, in which she proves that Hamas was weaponizing rape on October 7th. Now, as I told you earlier, I am way past, and have for a very long time, been way past dismissing things with which I disagree in a flippant way. I passed the bourgeois propaganda stage. I passed the Zionist propaganda stage. That's not for me a satisfactory response. I didn't know what to make of the original claims about rape having been weaponized. I didn't know what to make of them. I was skeptical. I was skeptical for reasons which I don't think many people were convinced by, but it convinced me. I know devout Muslims, and I know roughly Gazan culture. And it did not, if you remember, and here I want to, say out loud, people did not agree with me, but they were describing the Israelis were describing gang rapes that allegedly occurred on October 7th, where the men were carrying on with such sexual bravado and such sexual confidence. You will recall they talked about cutting off a woman's breast and tossing it around, things like that. And most of the guys who burst the gates of Gaza were around 20 years old. They weren't married because Hamas was a large enough organization, not the claims that are made, but probably around 15,000 people. They're not going to send what was effectively a suicide mission, except for the ones who were supposed to bring back hostages, but in general it was a suicide mission. They're not going to put people on the suicide mission who have family. Family is important there. Children are important there. The father is the breadwinner. So it's basically, because of Muslim culture, it was basically guys who had no sexual experience who burst through the gates of Gaza. And so the images that were being projected were like of a pathological frat house. Something out of like Friday the 13th or something, gang rapes, tossing around breasts like footballs. That doesn't sound like young men from Gaza. I'm not saying they're not capable of it. And I remember a good friend of mine, Muin Rabbani, who I think the world of, he said, well, in war, things happen. Yes, I will grant that, but I didn't believe this. It just didn't sound right. But as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, he liked to quote what was then a British proverb, facts are stubborn things. I have to get the facts. This is a speculation. It's a hunch. It's not a fact. So I started to look what was the evidence that was being adduced in support of this claim. There was no forensic evidence. There was no what's called medical legal evidence. The claim, and it did have a patina of plausibility, was the numbers of people killed were so large on October 7th, and they were processing the bodies so rapidly that they had no time to preserve any possible forensic evidence, semen, things like that. Okay, I kind of thought that was plausible, but there was one thing that didn't strike me as plausible. So in Pramila Patten, who was sent on this quote-unquote, wasn't an investigation. She said, because I don't know anything about investigations. Whatever she was on, I never knew what exactly she was supposed to do. She said she was supposed to give voice to the victims. I thought, well, that's a little bit premature because you don't know if there were victims of rape. That's what you're supposed to find out before you give voice to them, okay? And here, you're as capable as me of rendering a judgment. So what tipped the scales for me was the following. Pramila Patten said, we looked at 50 hours of video, 50 hours of digital, they call it digital evidence. And it was from every possible source. There was CCTV. There was dash cam video, digital evidence. There was body cam digital evidence from the militants who were killed. They had the cameras, okay? There was iPhone, all right? 50 hours, which is not a small amount. That's several Cecil B. DeMille extravaganzas. And she said we looked at 5,000 photographs. Again, not a small amount. And she said we have no digital or photographic evidence of sexual violence. Those are her words. No digital. So
striking.
That did not seem to me very plausible. You're describing gang rapes to the left of me, gang rapes to the right of me. That's what they're describing at the Nova Music Festival, where the biggest killings occurred. They're saying gang rapes, gang rapes, gang rapes. And then your generation, which is not my generation, you know that your generation documents everything. You go to a restaurant with somebody and they serve the dishes. Waiter, can you take a picture of the dishes? You take a picture of this. You can take a picture of that. Now, the alleged witnesses, they said they were hiding when they observed the gang rapes. You didn't take out a camera? Now you say, well, maybe it's wartime. Well, I got news for you. Israelis are posting every day on the social media, on Facebook and elsewhere, images of what they're doing in Gaza. I mean, it's just so off the wall. I mean, really, very sick country, very sick country, very sick. But they're posting all these images in the middle of the war. And no one, not one picture, not one image. Is that plausible? Well, what do you say? Is that plausible?
No, it seems unlikely to me.
Yes. So when she said we have no digital evidence of rape, no photographic, of rape, of sexual violence, none, I say, you lose me. So Sheryl Sandberg, to return to the former chief operating officer of Meta, a billionaire, formidable personality, for sure. She knows academic standards. She knows academic standards. She knows scholarly standards. She knows evidentiary standards. She's got to. You're not the top student in your class in economics at Harvard University and not know evidentiary standards. She writes of, she makes this documentary called Screams Before Silence. She says it's the biggest achievement of her life, the one she takes such pride in. And aside from interviewing witnesses, nothing. Nothing. You know, these are for the cause. You remember how I said in the 80s, every Jewish intellectual wants to do something for the cause? It's the same thing. After October 7th, they want to do something for the cause to show that, you know, the solidarity and that they are willing to make, I know it's laughable, but to make sacrifices for the cause. So this is her biggest achievement. And I wrote in the book, if this is her biggest achievement, then she's lived a squandered life. I didn't, you know, people ask me what I entered with presumptions, prejudices. As I said, it seemed implausible to me. But I had enough criticism when I said, I don't believe those guys. I just don't believe this. I don't want to get into personal detail, But you know, every guy, first sexual experience, you feel awkward. Am I wrong here?
You're not wrong.
And so, but this sounded like gang rapes, tossing around like a football. You know, there was a level of bravado which just didn't seem congruous for me, knowing the young men, you know? But after that, of course, my responsibility is to look carefully at the evidence. And you will note, as I note in the book, or in the chapter, both Human Rights Watch and the UN Commission of Inquiry, even though they were very harsh on Hamas, maybe deservedly so, maybe not, I won't go into that, both of them said, quote, "We cannot confirm that rape occurred on October 7th. We cannot confirm those accounts." I think that's pretty damaging. I think that's pretty damaging.
What then was the play, and to what extent was it successful that Israel and its media trumpeted these claims so?
Well, they resonate here. You know, it's the subconscious, the unconscious. It's the rape by dark-skinned people that has a very huge, has a deep history and a huge resonance in the United States. I mean, parts of it were just frankly ugly. They really, can I use the word, irked me? So let me give you one example. The head of the UN Commission of Inquiry, her name is Navi Pillay, Pillay. She's from South Africa. She's of Indian descent, if I'm not mistaken. And she has a good record. She was the UN Human Rights Chief. She's serious, no question in my mind about it. So she says, as we already stated, we cannot confirm the accounts of rape on October 7th. But then she starts accusing Hamas of not rape, but sexual violence. Okay, or the report accuses Hamas of sexual violence. Okay, I'm ready to listen. So what kinds of evidence do they put forth? They said that when the women were taken hostage by Hamas, they were forced to sit between two men on a motor scooter. A lot of the Hamas militants entered on a motor scooter. They were forced to sit between two men on a motor scooter. And the report, the UN Commission of Inquiry, the report calls that coerced intimacy, sexual violence, coerced intimacy. Well, first of all, okay, taking a person hostage, it's a war crime. I'm not going to quarrel with that. That's what the law says. But does the law say that if you take a woman hostage, you have to order her an Uber? I mean, it's just stupid. And then there is that racist undercurrent, like she has to sit between two Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
She has to, so disgusting. I don't even think, if it were two white people, I don't even think it would occur to anyone to speak about sexual, coerced intimacy. I mean, for Christ's sake, every time a white woman goes into a subway car at rush hour and she has to stand between two black men, okay? Should we then sue the MTA for coerced intimacy? Okay, so someone says, it's not the same thing because she's not forced to. Well, guess what? She is forced to. She has to get home. So why shouldn't we separate the cars between blacks and whites so that white women don't have to suffer the ordeal of coerced intimacy with black men? It's completely crazy. It was people who They're so afraid of the Israelis. They're so afraid of the Israelis and all their supporters that they conjure these things like coerced intimacy as sexual violence because they couldn't say rape happened. There was no evidence. But they have to vindicate Israel some way. Some way. You can't give, Israel has been blasting away at this rape charge. So you can't call them complete liars. You're too afraid. So you conjure these instances of sexual violence, not rape, sexual violence, in order to vindicate, at least in part, Israel. Because you can't say it's all lies. They're too afraid. It's cowardice. Navi Pillay is not a bad person. I know that. I recognize that. And I had a question in my mind, which I will freely admit. I was going to put on the front cover, as on wanted posters, Pramila Patten, Julia Sebutinde, Fatou Bensouda, and Joan Donahue. And I was debating whether or not I would put Navi Pillay, because I respect her. Here, I think it's not careerism, as it was with Joan Donahue. I don't believe it's bribery or blackmail, as it was with Fatou Bensouda and Julia Sebutinde. I think it's just cowardice, fear. Sheryl Sandberg, it's the cause. You think you're doing, I'm Chai Israel. Israel lives. It's our cause. She's doing something for the Jewish people. She imagines in her mind, and she's being very heroic and courageous. Like it's you pay a big price in the United States for going out on the limb and defending Israel. It's all completely laughable. But Pillay, I think it was just fear that she would be tarred and feathered professionally if she said everything Israel was saying was a lie. So they come up with these utterly preposterous categories like coerced intimacy. That's how I see it, but I can't, those are speculations. I can't prove it. Look, the irony is, this is the way politics is. Obviously, Hamas did horrible things on October 7th. You didn't need a rape charge. You really didn't. But they get carried away, and especially because all they care about is the Americans, and they knew that charge of dark-skinned people committing rape will strike a chord in the United States. So they ran with it, but ultimately, what did they do? They ultimately discredit themselves. Because when that charge proves to be false, what do you think people are going to think? That everything Israel said about October 7th was false, which is not true. I get a lot of email, a lot of correspondence, people saying to me, well, that a lot of the folks were killed in firefights, and Israel, killed a lot of them, and there's this evidence and that evidence. I said, well, look, I wasn't there, but I've gone through the record carefully. And 850 civilians were killed on October 7th. And I do not believe there's plausible evidence that a significant number were killed by Israel in crossfire. I do not. So I'm not going there. I'm not going down that route. I'll go down the route if you show me the evidence, but I've not seen the evidence of that. And even Hamas, if you listen to them closely, they gave contradictory accounts of what happened. Sometimes they said, well, all the people at the Nova Film Festival, they served in the army, and everybody serves in the army. It's a citizen army, and therefore they're all settlers, and therefore they're legitimate targets. And then they said, in another account, they said, well, it wasn't the Hamas fighters who committed the atrocities, but the riffraff from Gaza who entered afterwards, because it proved to be so easy to break through the fence. And it's true, a lot of Gazans who had nothing to do with the attacks entered Israel. But they never, as I said, they weren't entirely denying that it happened. They weren't saying, well, Israel killed all the 850 civilians. They were either saying those were legitimate targets or it wasn't Hamas. So I didn't find plausible at all that those killings occurred by Gazans, and almost certainly by Hamas, But on this particular rape thing, it's not true. It's not true, and it was used to abet a genocide. It was used, and Sheryl Sandberg stands guilty of that. She had to know what she was saying. Not necessarily that it was not true, but she certainly had to know that by normal evidentiary standards, you don't go out and make a 40-minute documentary based on teary-eyed, quote-unquote, witnesses. No, that's not a documentary. That's not serious. If you had done that at Harvard in your freshman thesis, I don't know if Harvard, I know Princeton, I don't know Harvard, but freshman, if you submit that as a freshman thesis, it wouldn't pass. You would meet with your advisor, and your advisor would say, well, can you give us more evidence? Can you give us more evidence? These are pretty sensational claims. Can you give, So she knew what she was doing. But they don't care. You see, that's the thing. You have to understand the mindset. I understand the mindset because I went through it. There is the little facts and the big cause. So, yes, it's true Stalin did this, and Stalin did that, and Stalin did this and that. But there's the cause. And the cause supersedes, it negates the little facts. When you believe in that cause, facts are trivial. They're not stubborn things. They're trivial things. And so for people like Sheryl Sandberg, even if the facts are not true, it's still true because the cause is true. Alan Dershowitz knew he was lying about a lot of the things he said to me. He knew that. He wrote on the Harvard Law School website that my mother was a collaborator with the Nazis during World War II.
That's an insult.
No, it's way beyond an insult.
Yeah, to put it lightly.
He knew it. He wanted to get a rise out of me. But they don't care about whether it's true or not. Because if it serves the cause, it's true. I know that mentality. I'm an old man now. I've gone through life. The Joni Mitchell song, I've seen love from both sides now. I've seen politics from all sides now. I've looked at love from both. You know that song?
I like Joni Mitchell a lot. I don't know if I know the tune, though.
No, you have to know it. I've looked
Do you know
at
what album it's
love
on?
from... No, it was very popular. Everyone sang it. Judy Collins sang it, but it was Joni Mitchell's song. I've looked at love from both sides now. When you put this on the web, you can put the music on. It's nice. It was a song of my generation. I've looked at life from both sides now. Politics in particular. I had a friend, he was a Vietnamese communist, high up in what was called the National Liberation Front. He took me on as his protege. He was my mentor. And at that time, I would say this is the late 70s, there was some question about whether or not Anne Frank wrote the diary. There was some insinuation that her father, Otto Frank, had in some ways doctored it after the war. And credible people, let me be clear, credible people were validating the claim, okay? And the guy's name, I'm sure he's passed now, his name was Nguyen Lan, Ngumanlan, Nguyen Lan, the high-ranking member in the Vietnamese communist. And we once got in the subject of the Anne Frank diary, because as I said, it was a local sensation for a little while. And I remember his response to me. He said, listen to it closely. He said, even if she didn't write it, she wrote it. Even if she didn't write it, she wrote it. You understand? If it serves the cause, even if it's not true, it's true. And that's Alan Dershowitz, and that's Sheryl Sandberg. Am Israel Chai. Israel lives. The Jewish people live. It's their moment. They came under attack on October 7th. Now the whole world is attacking them and accusing them of genocide. We have to close ranks. Am Yisrael Chai. Israel lives. That's the mentality. I once, by accident, I was in the Upper East Side, which I'm not normally on, with a friend of mine, a Lebanese friend of mine, who was treating me to dinner, and Alan Dershowitz is in the restaurant. And my friend recognizes him. I point him out, of course I recognize him. And my friend says, you want me to call him over? Oh, God, that was one of those moments, because I knew my mother, okay? I didn't know her as well as I thought I knew her. You learn what you don't know as you get older, or you realize things that you didn't understand at the time. But I thought I knew her. And I knew that after what Alan Dershowitz said about her, if I didn't take, I'm serious now, I can be prone to theatrical exaggeration, mostly for humor, but I can also be quite literal, morally serious. If I didn't take the first train down to Cambridge and throttle Alan Dershowitz, she would never speak to me again. You get me? You said that's, what'd you call it, an insult? No, it's way beyond insult, my friend. You're saying that my mother collaborated with the people who exterminated her family. That's way beyond insult, okay? In 1979, I attended with my mother a trial in Düsseldorf. At that point, it was West Germany, of the last guards. It was the last major trial of the guards of the Majdanek concentration camp. And as you can imagine, it was for my mother, I don't know, facing destiny in reverse. So we didn't know that the guards were released every night on their own recognizance. And the guards walked freely in the courthouse. And my mother was just beside herself. She was screaming, "You let those animals walk in the courthouse? You let those," she was off. I don't, begrudge her or anything. I'm just telling you. And then one night, after she gave her testimony, the worst of the guards was a woman named Brigida. And after we gave the testimony, we're walking down the staircase of the courthouse. We walk out into the street of Düsseldorf. My mother, she's to my left. I turn to my right. Almost shoulder to shoulder is Brigida. So I didn't know what to do. I waited for Brigida to get like maybe 100 or 200 feet ahead of us. It was dark already. I turned to my mother and I said, "Mom, do you know who that is?" She squinted. She looked. She said, her eyes like, a doe in the headlights. "Brigida?" I said, "Yeah." And I turned to my mother. I said, "What do you want me to do?" She went like this. "Get her! Get her! They think we're sheep! Get her!" And she knew if I did what she wanted me to do, and I knew what she wanted me to do, I would get arrested. I'd get life. And my mother loved me too much, way too much, over the top. Get her! So back to the Indian restaurant. When the guy said, "Should I call him over?" I thought my mother would despise me, hate me. But you know what? My curiosity got the better of me. It did. I'm ashamed. Actually, I have to be honest, I'm ashamed. Just bring him over. And Dershowitz wanted to come over. You know why?
Why?
He wanted to normalize our relationship. Not because he cares about me as a person, but because he said all these disgusting things. And I was accepting him. So it sort of canceled what he did. And he sat down. I said, I'm just curious about something. Why did you say those things about my mother? I'm curious. And he said, "Well, you wrote this." And I said, "Look, Professor Dershowitz, I'm not one to begrudge other people's achievements. When they are deserving of respect, I respect them. You went to Brooklyn College, a modest college, where, as it happens, I teach now, but I'm talking about the present. And then you went to Yale Law School, and you graduated first in your class. You must be a smart guy. And then you end up being the youngest tenured professor at Harvard Law School. No small achievement. I recognize that." I said, "Now, I've read all your books the last 30 years, and they're completely worthless or garbage." I was surprised at his reaction. You know what his reaction was when I said that? He just shrugged his shoulders like, what can I do about it? Because he was smart enough to know they were pure junk. They're garbage, worthless, totally. I don't say I'll acknowledge an achievement, but I'm also going to acknowledge garbage. You know, I said about Benny Morris, your first book, some excellent. I keep them with pride in my bookshelf. Your more recent stuff, pure garbage. You should be ashamed of it. You know, good is good, bad is bad. I said, you know, worthless. But you can read, that's for sure. You know I didn't say that. You know I never said my mother was in capo. You know that. Please, I said, let's not go there. Let's not go there. You know what you're saying is not true. So you know what he said to me? He said, after what you said about me plagiarizing the book, what did you expect me to do? I said, he knew that what he said about my mother wasn't true, but he didn't care. What do you expect me to do? I'm going to get even. You know, I'm going to get even with you. But in general, Dershowitz knows everything he writes about Israel is not true. Of course he knows. Of course he knows. But it makes no difference. It's the cause. He came from a very conservative, I guess Orthodox, but I don't want to say for sure, Jewish home. And Am Yisrael Chai, Israel lives. And it was exactly the mindset of Nagu Manlan. If it serves the cause, even if it's not true, it's true. Even if it's not true, it's true. That's Sheryl Sandberg, that's all of them. That's Bill Ackman, it's a different thing. Bill Ackman, he has a trophy wife. You know, this really vivacious, beautiful Israeli woman. And she's a former Israeli pilot. You know, and so you can imagine her saying, you know, to Ackman, do this and do that. And he's a complete thug. No, it's really quite astonishing. This guy, they're so arrogant, the rich. You know, sometimes you could have a rich person who has some humility. He takes upon himself, he has the right to decide who's going to be the president of Harvard. He's going to decide. Christine Gay has to go. They got rid of her. They got rid of McGill at U of P. They got rid of Shafiq at Columbia. The arrogance. You know, there was a book written by William Fulbright about the United States in the 1960s. It was during the Vietnam War. And the book was called, it had an influence on me. It's called The Arrogance of Power. The arrogance of these billionaires, that they decide who's going to be the president. You know, so his motive, I think, is a little bit different. They've destroyed the Ackmans, the billionaire Jewish supremacists. They've destroyed academic freedom in our country. It's the most astonishing result of the Gaza genocide in the US. Academic freedom has been completely destroyed. They just used their leverage with the money. Just 2 weeks ago, Harvard they introduced these draconian limits on free speech at Harvard now. So I think I'm sure he believes, actually a lot of people believe, that if it serves the cause, it's true. That's the problem when you have that mindset with so much money.
What are these new draconian limitations?
They implemented what's called the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which basically means, I mean, the bottom line is you can't criticize Israel. You can't criticize Israel. Then they're setting up a new anti-Semitic task force, anti-Semitism task force at Harvard, all sorts of things. You'll know the story? Oh, there was a settlement with some Jewish students claiming that they were oppressed at Harvard, and there was a settlement 2 weeks ago, and Harvard just completely caved in, or completely abandoned academic freedom as a concept. And I have to say, in my opinion, cancel culture was in part responsible for that. Because you have to know our history. You know what was the signature liberal law, a legal case in the 1980s, I think it was? There was a community in Illinois called Skokie, Skokie.
Near where I grew up.
Okay, and it was said to have a large community of Holocaust survivors living there. And the Nazi Party wanted to march through Skokie, its right of assembly. All right? And the case was litigated. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, it sided with the Nazi Party. In fact, a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust was the head of the ACLU, and I think it's Aria Neyer, N-E-I-E-R. I don't want to say for certain, but I'm pretty sure. He was one of the defendants, one of the defense attorneys for the ACLU. Well, he was ACLU, and they represented the Nazi Party. Okay, and that was a victory for freedom of speech. What happened with the cancel culture is they fabricated new standards of speech. Speech which anyone perceived as being unwelcome, making you feel unwelcome, uncomfortable, or unwanted. Those were the categories. Unwanted, uncomfortable. Well, in my day, the notion was college was supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to challenge your most deeply held convictions. That was the whole point of college, or what was said to be the whole point of a liberal arts education, to challenge your beliefs and to make you feel uncomfortable in those beliefs. And now uncomfortable became the standard for suppressing speech. So that was a disaster, and I said so in my book, I'll Burn That Bridge. I said, page 37, I said, if Palestinian students start claiming that if a visiting speaker makes them feel uncomfortable or unwanted or unsafe, that was grounds for counseling the speaker, I said, it's only a matter of time before Jewish students use that same standard against you. And I was right. I can't claim any great prophetic competences or gifts there. It was obvious what was going to happen. It's going to backfire. But one thing I didn't realize when the woke brigade uses that argument about unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable, they have no resources behind them. They're mostly just, campus radicals. But when the other side used it, after October 7th and the demonstrations, when they started to say these encampments make them feel unwoke, unsafe, and uncomfortable, along comes the Jewish supremacist billionaire class, and they have resources. And they started to tell the university administrations, if you don't crush these encampments, you're not getting our money. And it was big money. Not so big. Harvard has an endowment in the tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars. I can't even remember. Maybe even be hundreds now. I'm not sure. Can't remember. And they would have lost, no question, they would have lost several $100 million. Ackman made the first threat. But then there was an open letter sent by 1,200 Jewish alumni to Harvard. And so, I start adding up the numbers. I think Ackman's was 50 million. So, they would have taken a hit. But was the administration going to end up in a torture chamber? Was it going to end up in jail? A conviction is something you're supposed to pay a price for. And since the most ballyhooed feature of American university life in particular is academic freedom, Harvard's motto is Veritas, searching for the truth. Was it such a big sacrifice for academic freedom and freedom of inquiry to say, guys, you don't want to give us your money? You're free not to. But we're not abandoning, not a, not an, the definite article, the core feature of American universities, the principles of academic freedom and freedom of speech. Probably Harvard and all the other schools. I mean, it's all over now. It's Columbia and every other school. Every other school. I talk to the activists. I'm in communication. Can't say anything anymore about Gaza. Can't say anything. They would probably have capitulated anyhow, even if cancel culture hadn't come along with its unsafe, uncomfortable, and unwanted criteria. But they made it easier. They made it easier. We're not going to give any money because because Jewish students feel unsafe. They feel uncomfortable. They made it easier. But it would probably have happened anyway.
Well, Norman, it's amazing how time can fly, but I was about to say we've run the gamut, but the truth is that I didn't even get to my notes at this time. So I guess this calls for another one at some point when the book comes out. Maybe we'll actually get to some more of that content. But as always, I learn a ton, not only new words from talking with you. So thanks again for coming down and having this conversation with me.
Thank you. I'll give you my first posthumous interview.